All right, good afternoon. Let's go ahead and start. So it is the 10th of April, also the day that you are scheduled to take your lab exam. So that is a reminder. It will be coming up later today, tonight rather. And then also there were a few questions about the lecture quizzes. So those have been posted on the McGraw-Hill Connect website, of course, and you have a deadline to finish those 7 quizzes. Now, there's no recommended way of turning those in as long as you do all of them before the deadline. So you could follow the posted schedule, which is recommended, and go along with the chapters as we finish them, or you can do all of them in one sitting just before the deadline. Um, that is fine too. Not recommended, again, as I mentioned, because sometimes people tend to rush and it's not uncommon for some of those quizzes not to get turned in. You also have the case studies to work on. The deadline was shared regarding that earlier as well. I did send out a couple of emails as far as your study guide for your lecture exam number 3 is concerned, which is coming up this Saturday. So hopefully everyone received that one as well. And the lab work, which will be due next Saturday, that was also sent out, and that one has to do with the urinary system. All right, so I believe those were all of the reminders for now. I'm finishing up with your final couple of remaining study guides that have to do with your lecture exam number 4, then your final lab practical, and then the comprehensive exam as well. So as soon as I'm completely done, I will be sending those out. So keep checking your inboxes diligently as you've been doing thus far, and let me know if you have any questions in that regard. All right, so here we are on chapter 24, which has to do with the urinary system. So we'll go ahead and start from here. So the urinary system, uh, as the name suggests, has to do with the production of and excretion of urine, which is the liquid waste in very simple terms, okay? And the medical specialists who deal with these systems, well, you'll hear a couple of terms for those. So, for example, you'll talk about nephrologists, right? Who deal with the urinary system, or you might also have heard the term urologists, right? So what is the difference between these two medical specialties, nephrologists and urologists? Uh, so nephros itself means the kidney. So nephrologists deal with kidney problems, right? So kidney function, diseases, and treatment. That would be the domain of the nephrologist. The urologists do all of that, right? Uh, plus, they also specialize in disorders of the male reproductive system. Okay, so for example, if someone has a prostate cancer or erectile dysfunction or prostatitis or benign prostatic hyperplasia, these are some of the common conditions that the urologists would address as well. So nephrology was incidentally my second rotation when I was doing my medical internship right after medical ICU. My second rotation was here. And so that came as a pleasant surprise because, of course, if you started out your work in the medical ICU, which is arguably the most intensive of all the medical rotations, and then you come across something like nephrology, uh, it feels like you have, it's kind of like I wouldn't say on a holiday. It's not quite that relaxed, but it was definitely a few notches down. Now, one thing to remember, the most patients that you will see in a nephrology ward, almost 90%, if not more, would be there because of two conditions, right? And these are two chronic conditions which people struggle with, and the incidence seems to be rising. I don't know if it has changed after the pandemic lockdowns or whatever. We'll have to wait for that data to come in. But the two conditions that you will see here is diabetes type 2 especially, and hypertension. So diabetic nephropathy and hypertensive nephropathy, those are the two types of kidney disorders that would land more people in the nephrology ward than any other. A lot of these people are on dialysis because their functions are not, their kidneys are not functional at that point. All right, so here we are. Kidneys are a couple of organs, right? Two of them that filter blood, as you can see here. And then if you look at the pictures, here are your two kidneys, the right and the left one, right? Then the kidneys uh, perform filtration. After the urine is filtered out, it travels down through these smooth muscle tubes called the ureters all the way down into your urinary bladder, which is just about here. And from the urinary bladder, it's expelled out of the body by means of the urethra. So this is your urinary system in very simple terms, okay? You can also see the adrenal glands on top of the two kidneys. Now, these are endocrine glands, as we mentioned before during the discussion of the endocrine system. They release hormones, right? Like cortisol, like aldosterone, adrenal androgens, all those kinds of hormones. So here you're looking at the two kidneys in a cadaver. This is an actual picture. So again, right and left kidney. Those are the uh, adrenal glands at the top. Here are the two ureters, the smooth muscle tubes that run all the way down, and they attach to the urinary bladder here, a portion of which is seen, okay? You might also see this kind of fork-like instrument, almost looks like somebody's trying to get a bite out of the kidneys or the surrounding structure, but that is actually a surgical retractor, which is an instrument that is used to retract organs so you can have a better field of vision, a field of view as to what you're looking at. Okay, you can also see, look at that, that's the abdominal aorta, and it's splitting into the right and the left common iliac arteries. You can see those quite clearly in this picture as well. One more thing that you would notice, the right kidney seems to be a little lower in location as compared to the left one. And the reason for that is the liver is right on top of the right kidney, as you can see. So therefore, the right kidney is kind of like cramped for space, so to speak, so it's a little lower. Here you're looking at the kidneys from a posterior view. All right, so again, right and left, there are the ureters, both of them leading down to the urinary bladder and then the urethra. So all of those structures are visible. You can also see that your last two, the floating ribs, they kind of partially protect the kidney. So if there's a blow from the back, right, these floating kidneys will offer some kind of protection um, to them, as you can see. All right, so next up here, we are looking at the function of the urinary system, and there's a number of them, as you can see. Obviously, they eliminate metabolic waste. So it's not only water, but it's things like urea, creatinine, uh, BUN, which stands for blood urea nitrogen. So these three are the markers of your kidney function, right? Whenever you're looking at your kidney function, you would like to check for your BUN, blood urea nitrogen levels, then your creatinine levels in the urine, and then of course urea, all right, slash uric acid. Okay. Uh, your kidneys also regulate your ion levels, sodium, potassium, and calcium, okay, that we would take a closer look at how that is done. It also maintains your body's pH. It controls how acidic or basic your body is at any given time. Your blood pressure is also controlled by the kidneys because basically the greater the fluid retention in your body, the higher your blood pressure. Uh, so when you're dehydrated, you typically, your blood pressure tends to be low, okay? So blood pressure is also related to the kidney function. And then of course, any drugs, hormones, as we see here, these chemicals are also eliminated, gotten rid of from the body using your pair of kidneys. All right, some other functions, and these seem to be endocrine functions of the kidneys, right? So they form calcitriol, which is vitamin D. They are the final step. The kidneys are the final organs that lead to the formation of vitamin D in your body, which you need for healthy bones and teeth, and calcium reabsorption from the kidneys and from the gut as well. It also releases a hormone called erythropoietin, and erythropoietin, which is commonly available in the generic form, epogen, is needed for red blood cell formation. So people with anemia, like cancer patients, patients with sickle cell anemia often, they would require epogen or erythropoietin so that their red blood cell mass can be brought up. Your kidneys can also engage in gluconeogenesis, which is the term that refers to non-sugary foods, non-carb foods like protein and fats being converted into sugar if needed. So for example, under starvation conditions, sometimes you'll have to convert fat and protein into sugar, and your kidneys perform that. That is called gluconeogenesis. Which structure of the urinary system forms urine? Kidneys do. And which structure stores it? Your urinary bladder. Uh, Two means by which the kidney helps to regulate blood pressure. First, by regulating the amount of water that is retained in the body, and secondly, by controlling the electrolytes, the calcium, potassium, and sodium levels that also control your blood pressure, right? Sodium basically is what? Salt. Potassium, sodium, and calcium, those are salts. So those are the two ways that kidneys can regulate blood pressure. So here they are, right? Bean-shaped symmetrical organs. Um, and so here what we are looking at is the surrounding tissue of the kidneys. So they're well protected, as we can see, right? So on the very outside uh, of the kidneys, as you can see here, in the picture is what is called paranephric fat. So it's a layer of fat that surrounds the kidneys on both sides. Then you have the renal fascia. And fascia basically, again, is a type of connective tissue, right, that surrounds your internal organs, including the kidneys. Then deeper to that is the perinephric fat, which literally means the fat surrounding the kidneys, right? And then right next to the kidney is a fibrous capsule. So there's no less than 4 different surrounding tissues that keep your kidneys protected and safe from injury, as you can see here. So if you look at this view in the picture, it seems like it's a CT scan, right? This is the uh, computed tomographic scans that you would see when you're looking at your organs, right? So you can also see your digestive organs, the large intestine, stomach, right? Even the blood vessels, the renal artery, the renal vein, all of those are visible here in this picture. All right, so let's take a look at some clinical issues that can affect the kidneys, like renal ptosis, which literally means, ptosis means when an organ or a body part hangs down because it becomes loose or lax. That's ptosis. Like your eyelids, for example, when if you have droopy eyelids because of like things like myasthenia gravis or a stroke on one side of the body, that's called ptosis as well. Renal ptosis is when your kidneys like protrude forwards. They're lax and loose. So this can happen in people. Yeah, so renal ptosis can basically happen in people who lose a lot of fat in a very short amount of time, like radical diets and those kinds of things. And so that can cause the kidneys to kind of like protrude forwards. And under certain uh, conditions, it can actually kink the ureter, right? So the ureter is kind of like uh, twisted over because of the kidneys moving forward, and that can cause a backup of urine. So the urine is unable to flow down. It uh, accumulates backwards into the kidneys, and that can lead to kidney infection called hydronephrosis. It literally means the water in the kidneys, right? And hydronephrosis, if not corrected, can lead to kidney failure, all right? Because of course the kidneys are unable to get rid of urine. So some other developmental anomalies that you can find with the kidneys, something called renal agenesis, which means one or sometimes both of the kidneys fail to develop properly. And if it's a bilateral condition, then of course you cannot survive unless you get a kidney transplant done or have to be on dialysis. A pelvic kidney, so remember, even though kidneys are pelvic organs, but they actually develop down in your groin region, right? And in males, uh, it's an interesting observation that the testicles, which are actually your organs of the pelvic region, well, uh, basically found in the scrotum, they actually develop where the kidneys are, by the posterior wall of your abdomen. And the kidneys develop down uh, closer to the testicles. And then as the male embryo and fetus develops by the um, 7th to 8th month of development is when the kidneys descend downwards from your posterior abdominal wall. Uh, and not your kidneys, but your testicles descend down and your kidneys ascend back up towards the posterior abdominal wall. They actually cross each other on their way. And so then the testicles end up in the scrotum and the kidneys end up next to the posterior abdominal wall. So a pelvic kidney is when the kidneys fail to basically migrate upwards, right? So they will still be found lower down in the pelvic cavity. Uh, then you can also have something called a horseshoe kidney where the lower poles of the two kidneys are joined together. So it's a horseshoe shaped kidney, okay? The two kidneys are fused. Usually none of them have symptoms, okay? Or supernumerary kidney, as you can see here, for that matter, which means you might have an extra kidney, okay? And so there are basically not many signs and symptoms. These are like benign or innocent anomalies that you would occasionally see. All right, so here what you're looking at is a kidney in a little bit more detail. You are looking at uh, what is called the renal cortex. Okay, so the renal cortex is this thin strip of tissue which is on the outer layer, the outer edge of the kidneys, right? Here's the renal cortex. Deeper to the cortex is the renal medulla. This is the renal medulla, all of this, okay? Then you see these pyramid-shaped areas called, suitably called the renal pyramids, right? So they look like inverted triangles, upside down pyramids, renal pyramids. In between the renal pyramids, you have this area called the renal columns. So the renal cortex is moving down in between the pyramids into what are called the renal columns, as you can see here. So then you have these regions called the minor calyx or the minor calyces, which all come together to form the major calyx, and then the major calyx flows down into the ureter. This entire region is called the hilum or the hilus of the kidney, as you can see. You also see the renal artery, which is a branch of the abdominal aorta, and here you see the renal vein, which drains back into the inferior vena cava. So you see all of these structures here, and there's some fat. All this yellow stuff is fat, the perinephric fat that surrounds and protects the kidneys. So again, the same structures are visible in this picture as well. So the nerves that supply the kidneys, you have both sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. The sympathetic nerves come from your 10th to your 12th thoracic vertebrae, right? Sympathetic nerves, again, are your fight or flight ones, the adrenaline uh, controlled nerves. And then the parasympathetic nerves, which are your rest and digest nerves, they come from your vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve number 10, as you can see here, okay? So what do sympathetic nerves do? They make you hold your urine, right, when you're in a fight or flight situation. Parasympathetic nerves basically promote urination, some things to remember. What tissue composes the fibrous capsule that directly adheres to the kidney? Collagen. And what are its functions? Protection of the kidneys. What are the regions of the kidney that drain urine? The pelvis, the renal pelvis, and the ureter, right? What three anatomic structures of the kidney are innervated by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system? So the internal and the external urinary sphincter, those two, right? So those are basically contracted when your sympathetic nervous system is in action. When you're in a fight or flight situation, it holds urine back. So your internal and external urinary sphincter, two, plus a smooth muscle called the detrusor muscle. And the detrusor muscle is also the one that contracts to promote urination. Sympathetic nervous system uh, inhibits that, the contraction of the detrusor muscle. All right, so here we are looking at what are called nephrons. So nephrons are your kidney cells, okay? And there's millions of nephrons that basically make up each of your kidneys, as you can see. These are microscopic structures. So what do these nephrons actually look like? So let's take a look here. So this whole thing, this is a nephron, all right? So what happens in a nephron is, and there's millions of these microscopic cells that make up your kidneys. So here you have what is called an arteriole and afferent arteriole with an A, right? An afferent arteriole, which brings the blood into your nephron. The nephron is this entire structure. So you have an afferent arteriole, right? And then the afferent arteriole uh, turns into this ball of capillaries called the glomerulus. This entire ball of capillaries is glomerulus, and then your efferent arteriole with an E exits, right? So the efferent arteriole comes in and the efferent arteriole leaves. And here's the ball of capillaries called the glomerulus in between. Now you can see that the glomerulus is surrounded by this kind of like a spoon-shaped organ called the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle, or also called the Bowman's capsule. All right, same thing, Bowman's capsule or renal corpuscle. Then the renal corpuscle or Bowman's capsule continues onwards into what is called the proximal convoluted tubule, because it's proximal, means closer here, and it's convoluted or twisted. Then the proximal convoluted tubule forms this U-shaped loop. It's called the loop of Henle. Loop of Henle, Henle, right, or simply the nephron loop, which is a thick descending limb, then the thin descending limb, then the thin ascending limb, and then the thick ascending limb. And then finally, you have this distal convoluted tubule, right? It's distal, farther away from the origin. It's convoluted, and then this actually continues onwards as the collecting tubules. Then the collecting tubules come together to form the collecting duct. So this is the whole structure of the nephron under the microscope. These are small microscopic cells, again, as I mentioned before. All right, so what happens in each of these areas of the nephron? That is our next topic of discussion, okay? So here's the afferent arteriole, which brings in blood into the Bowman's capsule. Here's the Bowman's capsule and the ball of capillaries within called the glomerulus. So uh, this blood is under some pressure, right? So it basically filters out. It filters out of your glomerulus and is collected into the Bowman's capsule, okay? And then the remainder of the blood is basically flowing back into your body through the efferent arteriole, okay? Now, what happens to the filtrate that accumulates here? Now, this filtrate is mostly 99% water. There's also some sugar in there, glucose, there's proteins, some minimal amounts of those. There might be drugs and hormones that might be produced in your body. So they're all here in the filtrate. Then the filtrate um, goes through your proximal convoluted tubule here. What happens here? 99% of the stuff that was filtered out is reabsorbed in your body. It is reabsorbed into the surrounding blood vessels called the vasa recta, okay? That we shall see in some other pictures, right? The vasa recta, the surrounding blood vessels actually uh, reabsorb much of the stuff that was filtered through here, okay? All right, so this was filtration here and then reabsorption. So then the rest of the fluid moves down here through your loop of Henle. And what happens in the loop of Henle mainly is reabsorption of water. Much of the water and salt is again reabsorbed through the loop of Henle. So these loops are there to further concentrate your urine, okay? Which means to reabsorb most of the water, uh, especially if you're dehydrated under those conditions. Most of it happens here in the loop of Henle. And then the remaining filtrate basically then rises up here and goes into your distal convoluted tubule. And in the distal convoluted tubule, again, more and more of that water is reabsorbed from the forming urine here, okay? And the greater the amounts of hormones like aldosterone and ADH, which literally means antidiuretic hormone, the greater the amount of water that is reabsorbed and retained in your body. The rest of the stuff is called urine. It has waste products like carbon dioxide, urea, ammonia, some drugs and hormones, and that is all passed out as urine through the collecting duct. Okay, so this is the basic structure and function of the nephron, as you see here. So then you have two types of nephrons in your kidneys, what are called the cortical nephrons, okay? 80% of your nephrons are cortical nephrons. They're called that because they're mainly found in the cortex. Here's the cortex of your kidney, right? The outer region. So 80% of your nephrons would be here. Uh, and you can see that their loop of Henle or the nephron loop barely dips into the medulla. This is the medulla, the pinker region here. But then 20% are the juxtamedullary nephrons, and they're called the juxtamedullary nephrons because look at their loop of Henle. It's dipping deep within the medulla. So these ones are mostly involved with concentrating your urine, with reabsorbing most of the water. That happens here in the juxtamedullary nephrons, okay? So two types of nephrons that you will see. All right. So urine formation is what we are looking at here, okay? And again, here's your nephron in pictures. This is what the nephron looks like under the microscope. So you can literally look at the Bowman's capsule, also called the renal corpuscle here. This is your proximal convoluted tubule, where a lot of reabsorption takes place. Here is your distal convoluted tubule, okay? And the same here. You can see the thick segments of the nephron loops. Here are the thin segments of the loop of Henle or nephron loops, and then the collecting duct itself. And these are the surrounding blood vessels called vasa recta, which reabsorb all of the stuff from the urine that you need, like glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, all the good stuff is taken up into your blood by means of the vasa recta here. All right, so what are we looking at in this picture? Again, this is your juxtaglomerular apparatus, right? Uh, and if you follow the flow of blood, follow the arrows. Here's the afferent arteriole bringing in the blood. Here is the ball of capillaries called the glomerulus. And here is the efferent arteriole, which is taking the blood back. What happens here in the meantime? Filtration. So these green arrows, they're showing you all of the stuff that was filtered out of the glomerulus, right? And what is that stuff made up of? 99% water. There's some amino acids, fatty acids, some glucose, sugar as well here. And so then it moves onwards into your proximal convoluted tubules. Now you're also looking at two different types of cells here, right? So these ones here called the granular cells, and then the deeper ones called the macula densa cells. So what is the function of each? As you see here, uh, the granular cells, they respond to stretch. When there's too much fluid or urine flowing into your nephrons, it stretches. And granular cells actually feel the stretch. And when they feel the stretch, they start releasing a hormone called renin. And remember that renin will eventually cause your blood pressure to increase. All right. So renin is a blood pressure boosting hormone which is released from the granular cells when they get stretched. All right. Macula densa, on the other hand, are specialized types of cells which respond to the amount of sodium or salt in the fluid, which is flowing into your distal convoluted tubule. All right. So if there's too much salt, then again they release renin, and the end result is the same. Your blood pressure basically goes up. All right. So both macula densa and the granular cells, as you see here, they are blood pressure increasing sensors. Think of them like that. Okay. So what two structures compose the renal corpuscle? It's composed of the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. All right. Description of each, well, glomerulus is the ball of capillaries where filtration takes place. Bowman's capsule basically collects the filtrate. What is the order of the components of a renal tubule? Okay, so efferent arteriole into the glomerulus, then into the Bowman's capsule, then into the proximal convoluted tubule, then the nephron loop or the loop of Henle, then the distal convoluted tubule, then the collecting ducts, and then the collecting tube, the collecting tubules, and then the collecting duct. What differences exist between cortical and juxtamedullary nephrons? Cortical nephrons are found in the cortex, and juxtamedullary nephrons are deeper down into the medulla. Differentiate between the functions of principal cells and the intercalated cells within the kidneys. Principal cells basically respond uh, to aldosterone, okay, and ADH. So ADH, as we go back here to your principal cells, ADH is basically your antidiuretic hormone, which is secreted by the posterior pituitary, as hopefully we remember. And so what the principal cells do in response to ADH is they reabsorb more water, okay? Then the intercalated cells, on the other hand, they basically control the pH of the urine, all right? So if your body is too acidic, they will turn the urine more acidic, so you get rid of extra acid. If your body becomes too alkaline, then they get rid of the extra base, so your pH stays at the neutral level, okay? The normal body pH is in between 7.35 to 7.45. So that's what uh, the intercalated cells do. All right, so then what are the two primary cellular components of the juxtaglomerular apparatus? Macula densa and the granular cells, okay? And how are they stimulated? Uh, the macula densa by the stretch, the granular cells by the stretch of blood flowing into the nephrons, and then the macula densa by the concentration of salt or sodium chloride. All right, so next up, we are looking at the blood supply to the kidneys, and it has been broken down for you. This, of course, is a nephron. Again, all of those parts that we talked about. Uh, so that has been blown up. We have zoomed into that area here. So let's take a look at the blood supply to the kidneys. So here's the renal artery, which is a branch of the abdominal artery itself. The renal artery then breaks down into segmental arteries, going to the segments of the kidneys. The segmental arteries get broken down into interlobar arteries, which further break down into arcuate arteries here. And then finally, the arcuate arteries give rise to the interlobular arteries. The interlobular arteries break down into even smaller afferent arterioles, each going to each nephron. then the ball of capillaries called the glomerulus, and then the efferent arteriole, which comes out. Okay, and then it drains out either into the vasa recta, the surrounding blood vessels that we see here, or the peritubular capillaries, which are found here. Okay, so this is the arterial blood supply to the kidneys. And so in this picture, you can look at the movement of urine through the different parts of the kidney here, right? So here's the filtrate in the Bowman's capsule. The filtrate comes out of your glomerulus. Then what happens to the tubular fluid, right? So what is the pathway that blood flows as it enters via the renal artery? So we just looked at it, renal artery to segmental arteries, to interlobar arteries, to arcuate arteries, to interlobular arteries, then to the efferent arteriole, glomerulus, efferent arteriole, then vasa recta, and the peritubular capillaries. What are the three major types of capillaries associated with the nephron? So the efferent arteriole, the glomerulus, and the efferent arteriole. Okay. What is the pathway of fluid filtered by the kidney from the glomerulus to its eventual excretion? So we just looked at all of those parts: proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule onwards. All right, so let's take a look at all of these things happening within the nephron, right? Starting at the glomerulus. So first up, the blood flows into the nephron via your afferent arteriole. Here it is, right? So here's the ball of capillaries called the glomerulus. The green arrow is showing filtration. So because of the pressure of the blood flowing in, much of this fluid is filtered out and collected by the Bowman's capsule here, right? The remainder flows out through the efferent arteriole here. All right, so then what happens to the filtrate? It then goes into the proximal convoluted tubule where much of this stuff is reabsorbed. So this purple arrow, all of these purple arrows are for reabsorption, right? So this is the movement of substances from the tubular fluid back into the blood. At the same time, you also have these uh, beige colored arrows, and these are showing secretion. Secretion is active uh, throwing out of waste products into your urine from your blood vessels, right? So it happens in the opposite direction as that to reabsorption. Reabsorption and secretion happen in opposite directions. So tubular secretion is the movement of substances from the blood back into the tubular fluid, right? And this continues happening. Here is reabsorption and here is secretion happening, right? Throughout the loop of Henle, then the distal convoluted tubule, and finally, by the time you get to the collecting tubules, now you have formed urine, okay? So what type of stuff is reabsorbed? Stuff that you need back in your body, like glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, much of the water, right? Salt, sodium as well. What type of stuff is left behind? Waste stuff like carbon dioxide, like urea and ammonia, which are breakdown products of protein, right? Creatinine, all of them. And certain drugs, uh, like penicillin, antibiotics that you might have taken, they are actually actively secreted and thrown back into your tubular fluid, as you can see here, okay? So this is what your glomerulus looks like, right? And so these are the membranes that form the glomerulus, right? So your filtration membrane, or the membrane of the glomerulus through which the filtration is taking place, is made up of the epithelium of the glomerulus itself, right? The blood vessel wall, then the basement membrane of the glomerulus, and then also these filtration slits, these little cracks or gaps in there through which the blood is filtered out. So you can see what that filtration membrane looks like up close, right? So this looks like your dialysis machine, right? When you perform dialysis, this is pretty much what that membrane is constructed as. Because remember what dialysis is. A dialyzing unit is your kidney substitute. So in people who have chronic kidney failure, for whatever reason, their kidneys are not working, that's where the dialyzing machine, it takes over that function, right? So the blood is basically passed through that machine, and all of the waste products are taken out by means of filtration, all right? And good stuff like amino acids and fatty acids and glucose is added back to the blood, and then this purified blood is returned to your body. That's what dialysis is. So dialysis is, again, It's a makeshift kidneys for you. That's what it is. So here in this picture, you can see all of the stuff that is filtered out in your Bowman's capsule, right? So water, glucose, amino acids, ions, some hormones, vitamins B and C, ketones. Much of this is good stuff, which will be reabsorbed as the filtrate moves through your tubular passageway, right? But some of them, like urea and some waste products, they would be let go of. So you produce about 180 liters of filtrate on a daily basis, right? About 99% of it is all reabsorbed back. So all you secrete or excrete as urine is only 1 liter per day. But you form a whole lot more of filtrate, 180 liters, as you can see, right? All right. So here are some examples of substances that are freely filtered across the membrane of the glomerulus, like water, glucose, amino acids, ions here, right? What is not filtered? Large proteins. Large proteins should not be filtered out uh, into the urine. And so that's why when you do a urinalysis, you test your urine, and if you see large amounts of protein, something called proteinuria happening, what do you consider? What conditions come to mind? What might cause protein to appear in the urine, right? Proteinuria. So let's say urinary tract infections, UTIs is right at the top of the list, right? If you have any kind of urinary infection, which is way more common in women than men, uh, especially during pregnancy and after they become sexually active. And we'll talk about those conditions. Uh, that's when you will see protein spilling out in the urine, right? Also, during early stages of normal pregnancy, but if there's ongoing proteinuria, protein in your urine throughout pregnancy, then you should consider a condition called preeclampsia. Preeclampsia is a genetic condition. It tends to run in families, in women, while getting pregnant and giving birth. So when you say preeclampsia, there's three disease conditions that form this entity. Okay, first one is high blood pressure or hypertension during pregnancy if your blood pressure shoots up. Second is significant amounts of proteinuria, protein spilling out into your urine. And the third is edema, especially of the face. Your face swells up uh, noticeably, right? So facial edema. So these are the three hallmark signs of preeclampsia. If untreated, in some cases, preeclampsia can degenerate into full-blown eclampsia, which is a surgical emergency. At this point, you have to deliver the child, whether the fetus is viable or not, because if you don't, then both the fetus and the mother are going to die. So you have to uh, basically perform an emergency uh, delivery at this point, right? Because in eclampsia, along with hypertension and proteinuria and edema, you might also have seizures that might set in. And this is a life-threatening condition, as I mentioned. How would you abort such an attack? How would you treat eclampsia? You administer IV intravenous magnesium sulfate, all right, for the seizures. Uh, and then for the blood pressure, you can use a powerful centrally acting antihypertensive drug like uh, sodium nitroprusside is oftentimes used, okay? And also another powerful antihypertensive called hydralazine. It's a centrally acting antihypertensive drug called hydralazine. So these two are used for the management of eclampsia, okay? All right, so here we are looking at the different forces that push the urine in, well, out of the glomerulus first, and then the forces that push it in the opposite direction, back into the glomerulus, all right? So what are some of the predominant forces that push the fluid out, that cause filtration of the fluid from the glomerulus out into the Bowman's capsule? The most potent one is the glomerular hydrostatic pressure, the HP that you see here, all right? So what is hydrostatic pressure? It's very simple. It's the pressure inside of a hollow organ whenever it fills up with blood, right? Consider a balloon. when you put water in a water balloon and the balloon kind of balloons up, well, that is hydrostatic pressure. You can also think of some bodily phenomena like erection, right? Erection is the same thing in both males and females. Erection is about uh, the hollow walls of the penis or the clitoris, depending on your biological sex, of course, filling up with increased flow of blood there, and so they get engorged. The same thing is happening here. The blood is moving into the glomerulus, and this hydrostatic pressure is pushing the fluid out. But at the same time, this blood that is flowing into the capillaries called the glomerulus have some protein in them. And this protein has a sucking in action. The proteins try to pull the fluid back inwards, and that's called the osmotic pressure. Okay, you can see it here. It's in the opposite direction as that of the hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure tends to push it out into the Bowman's capsule. The osmotic pressure of the proteins attempts to suck it back in. At the same time, you also have the hydrostatic pressure of the surrounding fluid, which is also attempting to push the fluid back into the glomerulus. So let's see who wins. Does the fluid move out of the glomerulus or back into the glomerulus? So the net pressure uh, of your hydrostatic kind is 60. The osmotic pressure in the opposite direction is what, 32? And the hydrostatic pressure of the surrounding Bowman's capsular fluid is 18. So 32 plus 18 is what? 32 plus 18 would be what, 50, right? 50 millimeters. But the outwards pushing glomerular hydrostatic pressure is 60. So you still have a net filtration pressure of 10. So fluid will move out at a pressure of 10 um, net pressure. Okay, so that's how you calculate it simply. The sum of forces pushing the fluid out and the sum of forces trying to push the fluid back in. So in this case, the fluid would be, filtrate will be forming at the pressure of 10 millimeters of mercury. And we just did the math here. So what are some of the factors that you can think of that will tend to push the fluid out? Increased blood pressure, right? So the greater the amount of blood pressure that is moving into the glomerulus, the more filtrate will form. So that's why people who have high blood pressure, hypertension, they tend to produce a lot of urine because this high blood pressure basically pushes out the filtrate into the Bowman's capsule much more readily, right? How about people who are dehydrated or people with low blood pressure, hypotension? The exact opposite. They do not form that much urine. In fact, they are at significantly lower blood pressures, they will develop anuria, which means they stop urinating altogether. And that's because the pressure is simply not enough to sustain this filtration here, okay? So what is your glomerular filtration rate, right? Which means how much of urine are you forming uh, on a minute by minute basis. Uh, so that's what we're going to look at here, all right? So let's take a look at some of the factors that control how much urine you're going to form or how much filtrate you're going to form at any given point. So there's two of them, uh, myogenic response and the tubular glomerular feedback, all right? So what are those two? Let's take a look at each in turn here. Myogenic response. So the more fluid that flows in through the efferent arteriole, right? It stretches the arteriole. So if there's low blood pressure, then there's less stretch, less fluid moving through the efferent arteriole. So the smooth muscles of the efferent arteriole relax. And so this causes them to dilate. So when they dilate, more blood starts flowing into the nephron, okay? So this is the myogenic response. And this is a compensation for lower blood pressure. So when your blood pressure is low, your efferent arterioles dilate, so more blood can flow into your kidneys to maintain your GFR, your glomerular filtration rate. Okay. On the other hand, if your blood pressure increases, too much blood pressure, that causes your efferent arterioles to contract. So now less blood flows to your kidneys. This is negative feedback again. And so again, the result is your glomerular filtration rate stays normal. So that is your myogenic response. You can see it here. Uh, The lower the blood pressure, the more these blood vessels dilate, the more blood flows into the kidneys. The greater the blood pressure, the more these blood vessels constrict, and lesser the blood that will flow into your kidneys. What are your kidneys trying to do? Prevent damage to themselves, right? If too little blood flows here, then your kidneys will shut down. And extreme low blood pressure, as an example. If too much blood flows here to your kidneys, again, your kidneys will sustain, uh, they might literally start to hemorrhage, to bleed. So this is negative feedback that is trying to maintain your glomerular filtration rate here in the normal blood pressure range. Homeostasis is what's trying to be maintained. All right, so what is your tubular-glomerular feedback then? Now this one detects the amount of salt, sodium chloride that is flowing into the kidneys, right? So if your blood pressure is increased, too much blood flow into your kidneys, into your nephrons, then your macula densa cells, they sense it, that there's too much salt uh, coming in, too much blood coming into your kidneys. So what they do is they cause vasoconstriction of your afferent arteriole, so less blood comes to the kidneys. It's the same thing. It's homeostasis, negative feedback is what you're looking at, all right? So what are your normal blood pressures within which your normal GFR is maintained, your glomerular filtration rate is maintained? So if your blood pressure falls below 80 millimeters of mercury, okay, then urine stops forming. That's not enough blood pressure to sustain filtration. If your blood pressure increases above 180 millimeters of mercury, then too much urine is being formed, too much blood flow into the kidneys, all right? So, so the higher limit is 180, the lower limit is 80. So here you can see it in this graph, right? The mean arterial blood pressure, it ranges from 80 to 180. This is the normal urine production in between. If any less than 80 and urine production falls, any greater than 180 and you have excessive urine production, as you can see. So what are some of the different mechanisms that control your glomerular filtration rate, how much urine you're forming? So here are some. The first one is sympathetic stimulation, okay, which decreases your GFR. Sympathetic stimulation, of course, is your fight or flight mechanism when you are secreting a lot of adrenaline, right? Under those situations, your afferent arteriole constricts and you form less and less urine. On the other hand, you have another hormone called ANP, which stands for atrial natriuretic peptide. This hormone, again, is secreted by your right atrium of the heart in response to too much fluid. And so when you have this hormone being secreted, ANP, it causes your afferent arterioles to dilate, to relax, and a lot more blood flows into your kidneys. You form a whole lot more urine. So you get rid of fluid from your body. Now remember, ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, this hormone is also used as a treatment for congestive heart failure. So ANP used for CHF, congestive heart failure, right? Because again, the problem that you have in congestive heart failure is your heart is not pumping adequately, it's weakening, it's failing, therefore a lot of fluid starts to accumulate in your system. You start getting bloated up, edema, right? So then when you give ANP, you end up excreting a lot of this urine out. You also give diuretics, which are drugs that promote urination. So diuretics are also a treatment for congestive heart failure, right? ANP and diuretics. Okay. So here you can look at the entire loop of how your glomerular filtration rate is decreased by means of sympathetic stimulation, all right, and how it's increased by administering atrial natriuretic peptide. So how does tubular reabsorption differ from tubular secretion? Tubular reabsorption is about taking in good stuff back into the blood from the urine, like amino acids and glucose and all that. Tubular secretion is secreting harmful stuff like some drugs and broken down hormones back into the urine. How are the components of the filtration membrane of the glomerulus arranged? So you have the epithelium of the glomerulus, then the basement membrane of the glomerulus, and then the membrane of the Bowman's capsule itself. What is normally filtered across the glomerular membrane? Water, small proteins, glucose, amino acids, all of that. What is not normally filtered? Large proteins. Certain diseases, kidney trauma, heavy metals, and some bacterial toxins can damage the filtration membrane. What effect would this have on relative permeability of the membrane? It will increase. Way more stuff will start appearing in your urine if that happens. What is the value of the net filtration pressure if the glomerular hydrostatic pressure is 65, osmotic pressure of the glomerulus is 30, and the hydrostatic pressure of the capsular fluid is 20 millimeters of mercury? Add these two, the osmotic pressure of the glomerulus and the hydrostatic pressure of the capsular fluid. So 20 plus 30 is 50, and subtract from the net hydrostatic pressure of the glomerulus. So 65 minus 50, you will still have some fluid forming at the rate of 15 millimeters of mercury. All right, so simple. What happens to the value of the net filtration pressure in question? If the hydrostatic pressure increases from 65 to 75 millimeters of mercury, then even more fluid will be formed. Then there would be a net pressure of 60 millimeters of mercury pushing the fluid out. If hydrostatic pressure of the glomerulus increases, what is the effect on net filtration pressure? It also increases. Is the relationship between hydrostatic pressure of glomerulus and the net filtration pressure indirect or direct or inverse? Direct. As one increases, so does the other. Does urine production increase, decrease, or stay the same in response to an increase in glomerular filtration rate? Increases. What are the three factors that regulate glomerular filtration rate? Myogenic response, the tubulo-glomerular feedback, and the presence or absence of hormones like ADH and ANP. All right, does each of these increase, decrease, or maintain uh, glomerular filtration rate? Well, it depends on your blood pressure and your hormone levels, right? Renal autoregulation is effective with a mean arterial pressure between 80 and 180 millimeters of mercury. Would renal autoregulation be effective in an individual with a blood pressure of 300 over 150 millimeters of mercury? No, that is malignant hypertension. Too much blood pressure, as you can see. A pressure of 70 over 55 millimeters of mercury? Nope, that is too low, too little of a blood pressure for renal autoregulation to be effective. In this case, when you have 300 by 150, too much urine would be produced. In this, 70 over 55, too little urine would be produced. Okay, so here we are looking at how do different substances move in between the bloodstream and the urine in both directions, all right? So let's take a look here at each of those in turn, all right? So let's talk about these terms as well here. Things like transport maximum and renal threshold, okay? So the transport maximum is the amount of a substance that can be carried uh, in your blood before it becomes too much to the point where it spills over into your urine, right? For example, for sugar or glucose, your transport maximum is about 375 milligrams uh, per minute of it, right? So if the glucose that is basically uh, going into your glomerulus of the kidneys, if that amount is greater than 375 milligrams per minute, then glucose is going to spill out and appear in your urine, and you will be exhibiting something called glucoseuria or glycosuria, which means presence of sugar or glucose in your urine, right? So what types of people come to mind when you talk about glucoseuria? Diabetic patients, patients with uncontrolled diabetes or poorly controlled diabetes where the sugar levels are so high that they're actually spilling out in the urine, okay? Renal threshold, as you can see, is the maximum plasmic concentration of a substance. Uh, that can be transported in the blood without appearing in the urine, okay? So those two terms, transport maximum and then the renal threshold, basically refer to the maximum amount that a substance can be present in your blood before spilling out into urine. So here we are looking at glucoseuria, also called glycosuria, and this happens when the amount of sugar or glucose in your blood is above 300 milligrams per deciliter. Again, this will happen in patients with uncontrolled diabetes, okay? And so what are the presenting signs and symptoms in diabetic patients anyway? So you here talk about what is called the three Ps, the three Ps of diabetes mellitus, right? What are those three Ps? Um, polyuria, polyphagia, and polydipsia. So let's talk about each in turn and what they mean. So polyuria, you are producing way more urine and having to urinate way more than is usual for you, right? So why does that happen? Uh, of course, because you have so much sugar in your system, including in your kidneys, that is sucking all of the water, all of the hydration out of your cells, and you are literally urinating yourself to the point of dehydration. That's polyuria. That's because of hyperglycemia, too much sugar in your bloodstream. Then how about polydipsia, which means thirst? So of course, since you are losing so much water, your hypothalamus is detecting that and it's telling you, well, you need to drink more water because you are dehydrated. So polydipsia, you are uh, always thirsty and drinking more water than what is usual for you. Finally, polyphagia, which means increased hunger. And why is that? In uncontrolled diabetes, the sugar is unable to get inside of your cells, right? That's why it's accumulating in your bloodstream. So your cells are being starved of glucose. And this is a paradox. Even though you are flooded with glucose all over, your cells cannot get it because there's no insulin there. So your cells are starving. And so that sends the message again via your hypothalamus that you need to eat. But that's not the problem. You don't need to eat more. You need insulin to get that food, that glucose inside of your cells. So the three P's of diabetes. Okay, so glucose reabsorption. How do you reabsorb sugar from the urine back into your blood? So here are those steps, all right? So uh, look at the first step here. Glucose is transported up its concentration gradient by secondary active transport, right? So what does that mean? Okay, glucose is basically being transported from the urine back into the cell uh, along with your salt or sodium ions. So these ones in purple, that's sodium, and the one in green here is glucose or sugar, okay? So what are you seeing? There's a whole lot of salt in your urine, not so much salt in your um, the epithelial cells. So which way would the salt particles move? According to the laws of osmosis or diffusion, of course, from high concentration to low concentration. So this is naturally happening. Your sodium ions are going from high to low concentration within the cell. But what does the glucose do? It kind of piggybacks on your salt, and it piggybacks and it also makes this journey from low glucose to high glucose against concentration gradient because it's piggybacking, it's using the energy of the naturally moving sodium ions. This is called secondary active transport. It's secondary because it's piggybacking on the sodium ions. And why is it active transport? Because glucose is going from where it's low in concentration to where it's already high in concentration. Now, once it gets here to these cells where there's a lot of glucose, there's not much glucose in the blood flowing by. Now the glucose can move easily from high to low concentration. So because it's diffusing down its concentration gradient now by facilitated diffusion. Why is it called facilitated diffusion? Because here is a glucose carrying, transporting protein. So whenever any substance is transported by means of a carrier protein, it's called facilitated diffusion, right? So in other words, from the urine back to the cell by means of secondary active transport, and then from the cell into the bloodstream by means of facilitated diffusion. That's what happens to glucose. All right. So how about salt or sodium? How is salt reabsorbed back into your bloodstream? Look at this. 65% of your sodium is reabsorbed in your proximal convoluted tubule, right over here. Much of it is transported. The remaining salt, 25% of it is reabsorbed here as the fluid moves down the nephron loop or the loop of Henle, right? And then the rest of it is reabsorbed in the distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting tubule and the collecting duct right here, okay? Now, how much salt is being reabsorbed here in your distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule and the collecting duct is a function of the presence of these hormones, aldosterone and atrial natriuretic peptide, okay? So if you have a lot of aldosterone in your system, remember, aldosterone is secreted by your adrenal glands, by the outermost zone of your adrenal glands called the zona glomerulosa, right? So aldosterone, what it does is it uh, increases the amounts of sodium potassium pumps found in your kidneys, right? In your principal cells. So the greater the amount of sodium potassium pumps, the more the amount of sodium that is being reabsorbed. So the higher the amount of aldosterone, the greater the amount of salt that you're reabsorbing. Something to remember. The ANP, or the atrial natriuretic peptide, does the exact opposite. The greater the amount of atrial natriuretic peptide, the more salt you're losing with the urine, right? More sodium and water that is excreted in the urine. So these two are antagonistic hormones. They work in opposite directions. This one retains salt. This one gets rid of extra salt in your system. All right, so here we are looking at how is the sodium transported in your proximal convoluted tubule. Let's take a look at your first step. So this was something we saw in the previous slide too. There's a whole lot of sodium here, not much sodium in the epithelial cell. So salt naturally moves from the urine out into your epithelial cell by means of facilitated diffusion again, because here is a protein channel that is uh, facilitating the reabsorption of salt. So once the salt is here, now how does it make its journey into the salt into the bloodstream? By means of the sodium potassium pump, right? And remember what the sodium potassium pump does. It uh, takes 3 sodium ions out and it replaces those 3 sodium ions with 2 potassiums in the opposite direction. So sodium, in other words, is moved up its concentration gradient by active transport right here, okay? So once you have a lot of salt here, sodium, it naturally moves by means of osmosis or diffusion into the bloodstream. So again, here it is facilitated diffusion. Here it's because of sodium potassium pumps, and from here into the bloodstream is normal, natural diffusion and osmosis. So you reabsorb salt or sodium from your urine all the way here into your blood, as you can see. What causes increased amounts of these sodium potassium pumps to form? The hormone aldosterone, which comes from your adrenal glands. All right, so here you can see again, aldosterone, it increases the synthesis of sodium potassium pump. So a whole lot more sodium is being reabsorbed into your blood from the urine. How about water? Okay, so let's take a look at the water reabsorption. So 65% of water is reabsorbed in your proximal convoluted tubule. 10% of water is reabsorbed again in your nephron loop, in the loop of Henle. And then the remainder of the water is reabsorbed here in your distal convoluted tubule, your collecting tubules, and in your collecting duct. And this is under the influence of the hormones, antidiuretic hormone here. Okay, so the greater the amount of ADH or antidiuretic hormone, the greater the amount of reabsorption of water into your system. So when you're dehydrated, right, not much water in your system, and you want to retain water, reabsorb water from the kidneys, your ADH hormone levels increase. And ADH causes more and water to be reabsorbed from the kidneys, from your kidney tubules back into your bloodstream, okay? So how does it do it? It does that by increasing the amounts of these channels called aquaporins. Aquaporins cause water to be reabsorbed from the urine back into the bloodstream. Okay, so ADH increases the number of aquaporins, resulting in an increase of water reabsorption. So when is your ADH levels high? When you are dehydrated, okay? So how does, and we know that alcohol actually dehydrates you. Alcohol is not a good treatment for dehydration. If you're thirsty, you should not be drinking alcohol because it will in fact dehydrate you even more. And so how does alcohol do that? Alcohol dehydrates you by inhibiting the secretion of ADH. Alcohol inhibits ADH secretion, okay? So what happens when you don't have enough ADH being secreted? You urinate more, all right? So alcohol promotes urination and causes dehydration by inhibiting the secretion of ADH. That's something that you have to remember. All right, potassium. What about potassium reabsorption? 60 to 80% of potassium is reabsorbed right here in your proximal convoluted tubule. 10 to 20% of potassium is reabsorbed here in the nephron loop or the loop of Henle, and then the rest of it is reabsorbed here in your distal convoluted tubule, the collecting tubule, and the collecting duct again, all right? And this happens under the influence of the amounts of aldosterone. So remember, what does aldosterone do to your sodium levels? It causes reabsorption of sodium. But remember, sodium and potassium move in opposite directions. So if a lot of sodium is being reabsorbed, then a lot of potassium is being secreted back into the urine here, all right? So the more sodium that you retain, the more potassium you have to get rid of. The more potassium that you retain, the more sodium you have to get rid of. These two both are antagonistic ions. They move in opposite directions, as we can see, okay? So based on aldosterone levels, uh, if there's a whole lot of aldosterone, which means it's retaining too much sodium, then a lot of potassium will be secreted in the opposite direction. You will be urinating potassium out, something to remember. How about calcium and phosphate? Same thing. Calcium and phosphate are antagonistic ions. They move in opposite directions. So if you have a lot of parathyroid hormone in your system, again, remember parathyroid hormone is secreted by the parathyroid glands, which are located on the two poles of your thyroid gland in the neck, right? So the higher the amount of parathyroid hormones, the more calcium is being reabsorbed in your distal convoluted tubule. The greater the amount of calcium that is being reabsorbed, the greater the amount of potassium. I'm sorry, the greater the amount of phosphate that is being secreted out in your urine. So again, these two move in opposite directions. So as you can see, the greater the amount of parathyroid hormone, the greater the reabsorption of calcium, the greater the reabsorption of calcium, the greater the uh, amount of phosphate which is lost in the urine. Phosphate secretion increases. So here we are looking at the amounts of uh, acid versus base and how acid and base are regulated uh, by your urine secretion. So as far as the pH of the blood is concerned, it has to be maintained within rather narrow limits, as we mentioned before, in between 7.35 to 7.45, right? And that is done by means of this regulatory action taking place in your kidneys. So what happens here? So the principal ion that you're looking at here is called bicarbonate, HCO3 negative. And this is what makes your blood alkaline, all right? What makes your blood acidic is hydrogen ions, H positive, something to remember. So your kidneys uh, deal with your blood accordingly. If you have a high level of hydrogen ions, which means you're too acidic, such as what would happen in DKA as an example, diabetic ketoacidosis, uncontrolled diabetes, or if you have sleep apnea, right? Or if you have overdosed on aspirin or something like that, your acidic levels are high. That is how when your kidneys will basically try to get rid of that extra hydrogen. So 80 to 90% of the bicarbonate ions are reclaimed in your proximal convoluted tubule, okay? 10 to 20% in the nephron loop. And the rest of it, the majority of regulation takes place here in your distal convoluted tubule, in the collecting tubule, and the collecting duct right over here, okay? And so that is what we are looking at here. If the blood is acidic, and again, who will have acidic blood? People with uncontrolled diabetes, people with sleep apnea, people who have overdosed on aspirin, all of them. Uh, if that is the case, then hydrogen ions, which is acid again, is excreted uh, increasingly by the type A intercalated cells, okay? Which means your urine will become more and more acidic. Your blood will become less acidic, it's getting rid of acid, but your urine will become more acidic. In other words, your urine pH will decrease, but your blood pH will increase. If you have alkaline blood, right, which is the exact opposite, so who would have uh, too much of bicarbonate, too much alkaline blood? People who are hyperventilating. When you hyperventilate, right, such as if you have a phobic attack or an anxiety attack, then you are blowing off too much carbon dioxide. And so that makes your blood more alkaline. So in these people, what happens is you will be secreting bicarbonate ions, you will be getting rid of it, but you will be reabsorbing the hydrogen ions. Again, you're balancing it out. So that results in your lower blood pH, your blood becomes more acidic, while your urine pH increases, which means your urine becomes more alkaline. It also has to do with diet. For example, people who are meat eaters, carnivores, they usually have more acid in their blood and then consequently in their urine. Okay, why? Because protein in meat breaks down into uric acid. It's acidic. So, um, and on the other hand, people who are vegan, mostly vegetarian and vegans, they have a more alkaline blood and alkaline urine as well. Okay. All right. So here we are looking at the major breakdown products of your protein. Urea, that is what your protein breaks down into, and urea and then uric acid. Okay. So basically, the greater the amount of meat or protein in your diet, the greater the amount of urea. So if you eat a lot of protein, make sure you're drinking a lot of water as well, because you want to excrete all of that urea and uric acid out of the system. If not, you might develop stones, kidney stones, and uric acid stones, to be more specific, right? When you have uric acid stones forming, high levels of uh, urate, something called hyperuricemia. That is what gout is. Gout is hyperuricemia, right? And so no wonder then that gout is more prevalent in people who are meat eaters, people who do not drink that much water or drink a lot of alcohol because that dehydrates them. In elderly males, it's called the rich man's disease, right? The rich man's disease because, again, eating a lot of meat, drinking a lot of alcohol, typically associated with the rich man's lifestyle. Uh, And what you're referring to here is hyperuricemia, too much uric acid in your bloodstream. Okay. Creatinine, again, is the breakdown product of protein as well, right? So when you are looking at your kidney functions, these are the three substances that you have to basically monitor. Blood urea nitrogen, creatinine, and urea. These are the determinants of your kidney function or renal function, okay? All right, so here is an example of certain drugs which are excreted out in the urine by your kidneys, of course. Penicillin, aspirin, sulfonamides, all right. Uh, Other hormones, adrenaline, noradrenaline, okay, these are also excreted out. These water-soluble hormones are excreted by means of urine as well. Urobilin, which is a breakdown product of bilirubin, which is derived from your red blood cells in the liver, right? Your red blood cells, the heme part of your red blood cells of your hemoglobin is broken down into bilirubin. All right, and some hormones are also excreted in the urine, such as your pregnancy hormone or HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. So that's when you take a pregnancy test, you basically use your urine. So if there's high levels of HCG in the urine, well, you get a positive pregnancy test. And also adrenaline or epinephrine. All right, so here we are looking at something called the countercurrent exchange system. The countercurrent exchange, okay? Uh, and so what does that mean? Okay, let's take a look here. This is your filtrate or your tubular fluid, and look at the arrows. It's flowing in this direction, right, from here to here. At the same time, you have your blood or your vasa recta, which is blood flowing in the opposite direction. So that's why it's called countercurrent, right? Urine going in this direction and the blood flowing in the opposite direction. So countercurrent. This is a countercurrent flow going on. So what does it matter then? Okay, take a look here. So on an average, the tubular fluid, which is flowing down, its concentration is about 300 milliosmoles, okay? After it moves down here to your loop of Henle or the nephron loop, then more and more water is being reabsorbed from the urine into your bloodstream, right? So this area is impermeable to salt. No salt movement, but water is moving out. So what happens if salt is retained, but the water is moved out, then your urine becomes even more concentrated, more salt here. How much more concentrated? About 1200 milliosmoles. So from 300, it became more concentrated to 1200 milliosmoles. Then as you start to ascend, to climb back up into the loop of Henle, now here, this area becomes permeable to salt, but it's not allowing water to be reabsorbed now. So the result is by the time that you climb all the way back up, your urine is even more dilute than what it was here. It's only 100 milliosmoles, right? So it becomes more dilute by the time it's here, okay? So this is called the countercurrent multiplier. At the same time, you have something else called countercurrent exchange going on, which is pretty much the same thing. It's the exchange of water and salts in between the blood and the urine, okay? So again, you start out at 300 milliosmoles uh, here in your blood, right? So as the blood is going down here and it's getting more and more salt being thrown out of the urine into the bloodstream again, it becomes more concentrated, about 1200 milliosmoles by the time it gets here. But then at this point, more water starts to join the bloodstream here as well. So by the time that it gets back up here, it's back to what it was here, 300 milliosmoles, okay? So here you're looking at the concentrations of water and salts in your urine. Here you're looking at the concentrations of water and salt in your bloodstream. That's the difference between these two pictures, all right? So what's the point of the whole situation? It's simply uh, leveling out and evening out the amounts of water and salt. So if the urine you're producing tends to be, it needs to be concentrated, this will happen here, right? If it needs to be concentrated, which means much of the water has to be reabsorbed, it will happen here, such as when you're dehydrated. If it does not need to be concentrated that much, such as when you already have drank a lot of water, then uh, it will happen here as well. All right. So you are regulating the amount of water and salt in your urine depending on whether you are dehydrated or overhydrated. And it happens here. And this is called countercurrent exchange. Why countercurrent? Because urine is flowing in this direction while the blood is flowing in exactly the opposite direction. And they're constantly exchanging fluids and salts, as you can see here. So what are the significant anatomic and physiologic factors that influence tubular reabsorption, tubular secretion? Well, the amount of water and salt again, okay? The greater the amount of water, the lesser the amount of reabsorption and greater the amount of secretion. What is the transport maximum of a substance? The maximum amount of a substance that can be carried through your kidneys without it spilling out into urine. How is it different from the renal threshold of the substance? Well, that is the amount of substance that can be carried in your bloodstream before it starts uh, spilling over into the urine. How is glucose absorbed across the two membranes of the tubule cells? Glucose is reabsorbed first by secondary active transport, then by means of facilitated diffusion, as we saw in the pictures, okay? Why are proteins said to be transported rather than simply reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule? Because proteins need carriers. Okay, they need special carriers to be transported from one point to the other. How does sodium reabsorption occur? Sodium reabsorption occur by means of two hormones, which are ADH and aldosterone. The greater the amount of aldosterone, the greater the amount of salt which is reabsorbed in your distal convoluted tubule, okay? Greater the amount of ADH, again, greater the amount of salt um, that is being reabsorbed. What is the effect of parathyroid hormone on the reabsorption of both phosphate and calcium? Parathyroid hormone increases calcium reabsorption, but decreases phosphate reabsorption. How is the movement of hydrogen and bicarbonate regulated by type A and type B intercalated cells? Again, type A cells reabsorb hydrogen ions, type B cells reabsorb bicarbonate ions. What are some examples of drugs and bioactive substances eliminated in the urine? Penicillin, aspirin, sulfonamide drugs, and bioactive substances like hormones, HCG, the pregnancy hormone, and epinephrine or adrenaline. How is the concentration gradient that is essential for normal function of ADH and water reabsorption established and maintained? All right. So the concentration gradient for the normal function of ADH depends on the amount of water. If we have too much water, lesser the amount of ADH secreted. If we have too little water in the bloodstream, the greater the amount of ADH and greater the reabsorption of water. Which substances are reabsorbed in tubular processing in the different regions of the nephron? Um, okay, so salt is reabsorbed, water is reabsorbed, calcium or potassium can be reabsorbed, which are secreted. Uric acid, urea, creatinine, carbon dioxide, all of these waste products, some of the drugs like penicillin, aspirin, etc., they are secreted. What are the general processes that occur in the different regions of the tubules? Uh, Proximal convoluted tubule, reabsorption happens here. Nephron loop, both reabsorption and secretion happens here. Distal convoluted tubule, connecting tubule, and collecting duct, again, both reabsorption and secretion happens depending on the concentration of various substances. All right, so what is the normal glomerular filtration rate for an average person? About 125 milliliters of fluid per minute. Okay, so this is how much of filtration or filtrate fluid we form per minute, about 125 milliliters of it. Okay, so then you have something called the renal plasma clearance test, and this is used to assess how good your kidneys are functioning. Okay, and so how do you collect it? How do you conduct this test? It depends on your GFR, depends on the product of your concentration of a substance called inulin. Inulin is an inert substance. It doesn't get reabsorbed. It doesn't get secreted either. So it passes as is. Times V, which is the volume of urine produced per minute, and you divide it by P, which is the concentration of inulin, which is found in the plasma. Okay. In short, what this is doing is it is calculating the amount of inulin, the substance that can be secreted in your urine from your plasma, or you are measuring the functionality of your kidneys, how well your kidneys are functioning. That is what the plasma clearance test is about. If the substance is neither reabsorbed nor filtered, it passes as is, uh, then the clearance is equal to your glomerular filtration rate. If the substance is reabsorbed, like happens with glucose and salt, then the clearance in the urine is lower than the GFR, or the glomerular filtration rate. If the substance is filtered or secreted, if it's poured out into the urine, then of course the clearance is higher than the glomerular filtration rate. Okay. So here we are looking at renal failure, right? And renal failure, of course, is a failure of your kidneys to work properly. It could be either acute or chronic, short term or long term. So renal failure basically, of course, refers to the fact that your kidneys are not working optimally and they're failing gradually. And there could be a number of reasons, either having to do with the kidneys themselves or having to do with some other organ for that matter. So just as an example, in congestive heart failure, when your heart is failing and it's too weak to pump the blood out, you will see kidney failure setting in as well, because of course you need adequate amounts of blood pressure to push the blood from your heart down to the kidneys. And if the heart is weakening and it's not able to get the blood across to the kidneys, they're failing too. So eventually you will have to strengthen the heart with drugs or uh, drugs like dobutamine and so on. But at the same time, you also need to make the kidneys work as well. So sometimes you have to be on dialysis while you're in congestive heart failure. So all of these systems are interrelated, as we can see. So what can cause kidney disease? Well, if you remember in the beginning of the lecture, I told you two chronic conditions make you end up with kidney failure than any other, and those are hypertension, which is high blood pressure, and diabetes, especially diabetes type 2. Okay, so those are the two chronic diseases that always have to be at the fore of our mind whenever we talk about kidney failure. All right, and the thing to remember here is once destroyed, the kidneys will not function again. All right, autoimmune disorders are again a major reason of kidney failure, like SLE for systemic lupus erythematosus, right? Um, Generalized autoimmune function. All right, so once you get to that point, there are only two options available for treatment, either kidney transplantation or you have to be on dialysis, which is not a long-term fix as is, of course. All right, so what is the purpose of measuring the glomerular filtration rate? To see how well your kidneys are functioning. What is the normal glomerular filtration rate for an average person? About 125 milliliters per minute. What information is gained by measuring the renal plasma clearance for a specific substance? Again, your uh, kidney function, right? To make sure that it's able to clear out toxins and other metabolites from your blood in a normal fashion. All right, so next you're looking at urine, and samples of urine are great for uh, looking at a number of things and a number of processes going on in the body. So we are looking at things like the composition, the volume, the pH, the specific gravity, color, and even the smell of urine. And each one of which gives you critical information about the underlying functions of the body. So what is urine? Well, 95% it's water, and 5% is dissolved substances called solutes. Now, this will vary from person to person. So again, in someone who's severely dehydrated, the water content would be much lower and the solutes would be much higher. That is concentrated urine. In someone who is uh, overhydrated, the water concentration might be as high as 99%. The solutes are very low. Okay, so it varies from person to person. Let's talk about a couple of conditions, and these are endocrine conditions that can cause either very dilute urine or very uh, concentrated urine. So the first condition is something called uh, diabetes insipidus, not to be confused with the better known diabetes mellitus, which is a sugar metabolism problem, right? So diabetes insipidus, and the other one is something called syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion, or SIADH, okay? So what happens in diabetes insipidus is there is a complete lack or uh, partial lack of ADH secretion from your posterior pituitary, right? So low levels of ADH, and remember what ADH does, it causes your kidneys to reabsorb water. So if there's low levels of ADH, you end up excreting and putting out excessive amounts of urine. So sometimes up to 20 liters of urine in a day, right? So that's massive dehydration. So diabetes, just like diabetes mellitus, remember the three P's, one of the P's had to do with polyuria, increased urination. Same with diabetes insipidus, only here you have low levels of ADH and it doesn't have to do with your insulin and sugar concentrations necessarily. Some reasons for uh, suffering from diabetes insipidus, well, there could be central diabetes insipidus versus what is called nephrogenic diabetes insipidus, okay? So what are some central causes of diabetes insipidus? Well, any trauma to the head that causes damage to your posterior pituitary, or a tumor growing in the brain that might impinge on your pituitary posterior pituitary gland, and that might cause central diabetes insipidus. All right, so central processes like brain trauma slash tumors, right? Brain tumors. They can give you diabetes insipidus, which the one that is central. How about nephrogenic diabetes insipidus? Here, you have enough ADH. The problem is not with ADH, but this ADH is not acting on your kidneys, all right? And a number of reasons for that as well. It's pretty much like the same as the difference between type 1 diabetes mellitus and type 2 diabetes mellitus. In type 1 diabetes, there's a lack of insulin, right? Just like there's a lack of ADH in diabetes insipidus, central diabetes insipidus. In diabetes mellitus type 2, you had enough insulin, but you had too much fat in your body, so that insulin was not acting on your cells. Similarly, in nephrogenic diabetes insipidus, something similar happens. You have enough ADH, it's not acting on the kidneys. So many different reasons. Kidneys are not responding to your diabetes, ADH. Sometimes uh, severe obesity will do it, right? Just like type 2 diabetes, severe obesity. Uh, and sometimes it's iatrogenic. Iatrogenic means caused by drugs, certain drugs. Iatrogenic, drug or treatment induced. That's iatrogenic. And one example of iatrogenic, nephrogenic diabetes insipidus is when you use a drug containing lithium, which is a heavy metal. And lithium is commonly used to treat bipolar disorder, right? Bipolar disorder, which is a psychiatric condition where you have depression alternating with mania, right? So sometimes lithium is used uh, to control that condition, but lithium is known to cause nephrogenic diabetes insipidus, okay? So that is one condition. Now, the opposite was syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion, right? Or SIADH secretion. And here it was the exact opposite. You have high levels of ADH, high levels of ADH being secreted, so you barely make any urine. Much of the water is reabsorbed in your system, and so much so that there's so much water that you can go into congestive heart failure. Your heart fails because there's too much fluid there, right? Uh, or you can suffer from hyponatremia, which is low levels of salt, because the higher the amount of water that you're retaining, the lower the amount of salt that is present. Okay, so those two conditions to remember. All right, so when you do a urinalysis, when you study someone's urine sample, first look at the volume. The average is about 1 to 2 liters. If you have too much urine being produced, again, things like maybe SIADH that we just talked about. If there's too little urine being produced, think of things like diabetes insipidus, right? Or low blood pressure. So uh, all of these things, blood pressure, temperature, diuretics, diabetes, other fluids, they all play into uh, the volume of urine that you're excreting. Then the pH, it ranges from 4.5, which is acidic, to 8.0, which is alkaline. So again, as I mentioned before, if you are more of a vegan, a vegetarian, your urine tends to be less acidic, right? Uh, but if you're more of a meat eater, then it's more acidic. So those are some of the things that you have to keep in mind as well. Changes in pH can also indicate underlying infections, UTIs, urinary tract infections. All right, so specific gravity of urine. So what is specific gravity? If you let a sample of urine sit or stand still on its own, how much of particles or sediment do you see suspended in the urine? That is the specific gravity. So a high specific gravity means there's a lot of stuff, particles in your urine. What can cause it? Uh, Pregnancy, for one, right? So causes of high specific gravity, right? Uh, Pregnancy. Also, if you have infections, UTIs, urinary tract infections, that means a whole lot of particles are appearing in your urine, right? Uh, Uncontrolled diabetes, again, high specific gravity because you're spilling out so much sugar sediment in your urine. Uncontrolled diabetes mellitus type 2, or diabetes in general, right? What else can give you high specific gravity? Dehydration. If there's not much water in your urine, then there's too much sediment. So dehydration, right? So these are some of the reasons for having high specific gravity. What are some of the causes of low specific gravity? The exact opposite. When you have too much water pouring out in your urine, such as what you see in what? In diabetes insipidus, right? That could be one of the reasons. Or overhydration, water intoxication. That's what it's called, water intoxication. Actually, the water intoxication would be in the opposite situation. When you have water being retained in the body, so not put out in urine. Okay, the color of urine tells you quite a few things too, okay? So for example, if it's a dark yellow amber color, you are likely dehydrated. It's concentrated urine. If it's basically clear, then you're likely normally hydrated, okay? Uh, so I was reading one of Dr. Oz's articles, not a big fan, just was spending some time at the airport and I happened to read it. And he said his criterion for seeing whether you're adequately hydrated or not is when you pee, when you urinate, if you can hold a book against a stream of urine and still read it across, then that is uh, good hydration. If it's dark to the point where you cannot read across a stream of urine, then you need to be more hydrated, right? His criterion for hydration, clear urine. Okay, so I do not agree with that necessarily, but yeah, visually you can see if it's dark urine, then you probably should hydrate more. So there are other factors that can change the color of your urine, such as if you have blood in the urine, right? Something called hematuria, blood in urine. That can change the color of the urine. Urine color change, hematuria, your urine turns a darker color, right? Some drugs will do the same. They will make your urine appear darker, such as if you take uh, a treatment for tuberculosis, right? So there's a couple of drugs that are used for that. One of them is called isoniazid. The other one is called rifampin, okay? And rifampin is actually notorious for turning your urine a red color, okay? So be aware of that. If you're on treatment, if you're being treated with rifampin for whatever reason, uh, that one of the side effects is it can turn your urine that reddish color, and that might cause alarm in some people, but it's simply, again, iatrogenic, caused by a drug. And the smell of urine, right? So if this, for example, if the urine smells has this fruit-like smell, diabetes, uncontrolled diabetes, okay? That fruity smell is because of ketones present there. So there you have it. All right, next up, we are looking at ureters, which are smooth muscle uh, tubes. They are retroperitoneal, located behind the peritoneum, and they carry urine from your kidneys down to the urinary bladder, okay? So they are made up of a mucosa, and their epithelium is transitional epithelium. In fact, one of the very few places where you have this type of transitional epithelium would be in the ureters, as you can see. Then you have the muscular layer made up of smooth muscles, and then the outer adventitia, which is made up of collagen and elastic fibers, okay? So here, this is a cross section, a transverse section of the ureters. Here's the star-shaped lumen, right? The mucosa and the epithelium is transitional. Then you have the smooth muscle here, and then you have the outermost serosa, which is, or adventitia, which is made up of collagen and elastic fibers. So this is typically what the ureters look like, all right? And so you might want to look at the function of the ureters using a technique called IVP, for intravenous pyelogram, right? Where what you do is you take a dye, a color, you inject it into the vein, and this dye passes through the kidneys and into the urine. And while this colored urine, if you will, is passing, you take an X-ray of the urinary tract. So if there's any blockage, like a kidney stone or a ureter stone or something like that, you would see it right here in a time-lapse view of the urinary flow, right? So IVP, intravenous pyelogram, that's used to look at obstructions like kidney stones or tumors or other problems in the urinary tract. Okay, then we come down to the urinary bladder here. So the urinary bladder is this smooth muscle, transitional epithelium lined organ, which is again retroperitoneal, which means it's found behind the peritoneum. It's not completely covered by the peritoneum, all right? And the position in the two genders. In females, it is in front of and slightly below the uterus, so anterior inferior. And in males, it's close to the prostate gland, right? Of course, males do not have a uterus, so it's in front of the rectum and superior to the prostate gland in males. And shortly we shall see the exact location. So here's the urinary bladder, as you can see. Uh, the transitional epithelium is the type that lines it. You can see the two ureters, which are emptying out here into the urinary bladder. You see how they kind of like kink, make this angle into the urinary bladder, okay? Uh, you can see the smooth muscle here in the walls of the urinary bladder. So this triangular area in between the two openings of the ureters, these are the two openings, and then down to the urethra here, it's called the trigone. And the trigone is surrounded by what is called the trigone muscle, all right? Trigone muscle is one of those muscles that contract to uh, promote urination, in addition to the detrusor muscles. So remember those two, detrusor and trigone. Well, trigone is actually the area, right? So the detrusor muscle is what you're looking at here. So the detrusor muscle contracts to push the urine out. The trigone is important because it's a common area of infection. Why? Again, because the urine actually pours out into the urinary bladder right over here. So any pathogens, microorganisms, germs that might be found in this region would multiply here. Okay, this is the urethra you can see. Uh, Here is the internal urethral sphincter, and this is the external urethral sphincter. This one is under our voluntary control. So if you want to prevent urination, we contract this, and children learn that function early on, right? Okay, what else are we looking at here? So if I were to guess as to what sex this person is, I would say female, because again, the urethra is rather short, as you can see. In males, it's quite longer, and we shall take a look at that as well. So here is another cross-section of the walls of the urinary bladder. You see the transitional epithelium lining the organ. You see the smooth muscle here, and then the adventitia, which is made up of collagen and elastin fibers. All right. This is again a histological section of the urinary bladder. You see the transitional epithelium. So then urethra is this fibromuscular tube. It is quite long in males and much shorter in females. This is the passageway for urine out of the body, as we can see here. And it's surrounded by two sphincters, an internal and an external urinary sphincter, okay? So let's take a look at the female sphincter and the female urethra first. You can see that it's much shorter than what you will see in the male, okay? There's the trigone again, the area in the urinary bladder, the openings of the two ureters. Here is the internal urinary or internal urethral sphincter. This is the external urinary or external urethral sphincter, the one that is under our voluntary control. This one is involuntary. And then you see some fat tissue, subcutaneous fat here in this region as well. Okay. Now look at the male urethra. Just compare how much longer the male urethra is as compared to the female urethra in the picture here. Okay. All right. Now, uh, the rest of the structures are the same here. Excuse me. Here is the urinary bladder. There's the trigone, the triangular area in between the two openings of the ureters, as you can see. Internal urethral or internal urinary sphincter. This is the external urinary sphincter, uh, which can be voluntarily contracted. Um, Same in the males. However, you are seeing an addition here. You see this gland, which was absent in the females, called the prostate gland. So it's a walnut-shaped, walnut-sized gland that you find in this area, okay? So it's right inferior to the urinary bladder, as you can see here in this picture. So what happens here is the presence of the prostate and of course the much longer length of the urethra. It's actually divided into three regions, okay? So the region that runs through the prostate is appropriately named the prostatic urethra, as you can see here. Then you have this smallest and the thinnest region of the urethra that runs through this sphincter of muscles called the urogenital diaphragm. This is called the membranous urethra. And then the longest region that runs across the entire length of the penis is called the spongy urethra, okay? Let's take a look at uh, some other structures here. So first up, you can see that the prostate is surrounding the prostatic urethra. As males age, 60 years and older, their prostate tends to get larger in size, something called BPH, for benign prostatic hyperplasia, all right? So approximately 60% of 60-year-old males will have some degree of benign prostatic hyperplasia. 70% of 70-year-olds will have some BPH, and by the time you're 80, 80% of 80-year-olds will have marked degrees of benign prostatic hyperplasia, okay? So what are some of the signs and symptoms of having a large enlarged prostate? As it gets larger in size, it of course squeezes the urethra closed at this point. So difficulty starting urine, dysuria, pain during urination, this feeling of incompletely voiding the bladder, getting up multiple times at night to go pee, something called nocturia, right? And having a weak stream and some dribbling of urine as well. All of these happen with benign prostatic hyperplasia when this region becomes constricted due to the enlargement of the prostate. Prostate cancer, again, is another it's actually the most common cancer in males right after lung cancer. So that also again happens in this region, all right? So prostate is quite an active area as we see. And clinically you can look for these conditions. So you can do a digital exam, something called a DRE for a digital rectal exam, where you will lubricate your index finger with a glove and actually you will introduce into the rectum of the patient and then gently palpate for the prostate. Okay, so this is called a DRE. And if you find these hard nodular fixed masses there, that could be a danger sign for prostate cancer, all right? But you have to be very careful during this prostate massage because you don't want to dislodge these cancer cells and send them metastasizing throughout the body for prostate cancer, right? Also for benign prostatic hyperplasia. It will also show you if the prostate is enlarged in that region. So some other tests that you can do is to look at the levels of a blood marker called PSA, and that stands for prostate specific antigen. Okay. Um, in normal reproductive function, what it does is it basically uh, l- uh, liquidates the semen. Okay, semen tends to clot. It has fibrinogen, just like blood. But prostate-specific antigen is a protein that makes the semen unclot afterwards. Okay, so if the levels of PSA are markedly elevated, high levels of PSA, that could also be a danger sign as far as prostate cancer is concerned. Okay. In addition, you're seeing these two organs here as well, and these are basically your bulbourethral glands, also called Cooper's glands, all right? And they also secrete and contribute to semen, as you can see. All right, so then the membranous urethra, which is the part that is surrounded by the urogenital diaphragm muscles. Here is the spongy urethra. Why is it called the spongy urethra? Because it runs across uh, this region called the corpora cavernosa, singular corpus cavernosum, plural, two of them, corpora cavernosa. So these are erectile bodies. They are spongy with some smooth muscle, and when a male gets an erection, they tend to fill up with blood right here. It's spongy, so it's like a sponge. It soaks up all the blood. They're formed dorsally, so they lead to the erection of the penis. You are also looking at the what is called the corpus spongiosum, which is lower. This is ventral, okay? And the corpus spongiosum, again, is a spongy tissue that also fills up with blood during erection. And this explains why it's almost impossible for a male to have an erect penis and be able to urinate, because when these corpora cavernosa and corpus spongiosum are inflated with blood, it literally practically squeezes the spongy urethra shut. So it's almost impossible to urinate. Also, if you have just ejaculated, reflexively, your internally urinary sphincter is closed. It's closed tightly shut, and therefore it's technically not possible for you to urinate right after ejaculation. All right, so we are looking at renal calculi. Calculus is a stone. So you're looking at kidney stones here in this slide. And there are many risk factors for who would develop kidney stones. Someone who's obese, someone who does not drink enough water or drinks a lot of alcohol, which leads to dehydration. People with high levels of cholesterol, again, goes with obesity, high body fat content and all that. People who have gout, okay, you can form uric acid stones. So these are some risk factors for people to develop urinary stones, okay? Frequent urinary tract infections, UTIs as well. All right, so speaking of UTIs, uh, they tend to be more common in females, as I mentioned before, for three reasons, all right, some of which are anatomical reasons. So why UTIs, urinary tract infections, are more common in females, okay? Number one, the urethra is much shorter, okay? Urethra is much shorter, which means it's much easier for microorganisms to ascend, to go up from the external opening all the way into the deeper urinary structures. Shorter urethra. Secondarily, when during the process of sexual intercourse, copulation, there is uh, friction in that region, and that can physically, again, introduce the germs higher up uh, into the female urinary tract. Okay, and a possible third reason for common UTIs in females is uh, the normal pH of the vagina in females is acidic, right? Just to discourage the growth of microorganisms, of germs. It's acidic, but semen is alkaline. So at the time of ejaculation, semen neutralizes the acidity of the normally acidic female vagina, right? So when the acidity gets neutralized by semen, it's much easier for the germs to pass through upwards into the female tract. So much so that you have a condition that has been dubbed honeymoon cystitis, right? There's literally such a term, honeymoon cystitis, which in other words means inflammation of the urinary tract secondary to the uh, honeymoon period or sexual intercourse. And that explains why women or girls who have just become recently sexually active have a higher chance of developing UTIs, again, because of the act of copulation itself, having a shorter urethra, and then semen neutralizes the acidity there, all right? So kidney stones, what you're looking at here is the arguably, subjectively, the most painful condition ever reported in the human population, all right? So let's quickly talk about the three most painful conditions in humans, subjectively measured. Number one is renal stones or renal calculi. Number two is unanesthetized childbirth, right? And then number three is bone cancer. Okay, the top three uh, intense pains felt in the human population. Okay, and it makes sense because the ureters, the urethra, the entire urinary tract is quite narrow. So any stone forming there and interfering with the passage of urine every time the urine is trying to like move out and there's like contraction of the smooth muscle, it's exquisitely painful. Okay, and the pain is characteristically described as um, loin to groin. So it moves from lower down, higher up, loin to groin, wave-like intense pain. Okay. If the stones are small, they pass on their own. If they're larger, then you might need things like lithotripsy or ureteroscopy. So what is lithotripsy? You literally take like a boombox kind of device, which focuses uh, like high frequency sound waves onto the stone, and these high frequency sound waves will shatter the stone, and then you pass out the gravel. Okay. Ureteroscopy, where you have this flexible fiber optic camera, this tube that you advance all the way up into the ureters, and then you could physically pull out the stone from there as well. Micturition means urination, right? Which is a reflex again. And here's the reflex, the micturition reflex, all right? So when the urinary bladder fills up with urine, up to 200 milliliters of urine, it stretches the walls of the urinary bladder, and this sensation is carried to the spinal cord by your splanchnic nerves, the ones here, S2, S3, and S4, right? And so the urinary, basically the spinal cord communicates back to the internal urinary sphincter to relax it, and then the external urinary sphincter, which you can relax at will, and therefore the passage of urine becomes possible, right? At the same time, you also have the sympathetic nervous system from T11 to L2, and these sympathetic nerves, since they are the fight or flight emergency nerves, they will constrict the urinary sphincter, so they will stop urination, all right? Sympathetic nerves promote urination, the sympathetic nerves stop urination, as you can see here. And they do this by causing the detrusor muscles to contract. So the parasympathetic nerves, they will cause your detrusor muscles to contract and your urinary sphincters to relax. Result, you urinate. The sympathetic nerves will do exactly the same. They will inhibit the detrusor muscle contraction, and they will cause the internal and the external urinary sphincters to constrict. That stops urination, okay? So that is the micturition reflex that we are looking at. And this reflex, again, is centered here in the brainstem. The micturition center is actually in your pons, part of the brainstem, down there. Okay, UTIs, we talked about different types of urinary tract infections, quite common in females. We talked about honeymoon cystitis and those kinds of things. Uh, and so we are also looking at how women are more prone because of the short urethra, which is closer to the anus. And that's why they tell you that when you wipe using toilet paper, you should wipe from the front to the back, not from the back to the front, because that might introduce harmful bacteria like E. coli and such from the anus into the urethra. And this is also one of the reasons why anal sex is such a risky sexual activity, because with anal sex, you always have this risk of introduction of pathogens, potentially pathogenic bacteria and viruses from the anal cavity into the vaginal cavity, and then leading to urinary tract infection, pelvic inflammatory disease, all kinds of things, okay? So if the urethra is infected in, in, uh, in a UTI, that's called urethritis. If the infection ascends upwards and gets to the bladder, then it's called cystitis. If it goes all the way up to your kidneys, that is the most serious infection called pyelonephritis. All right, so these are progressively ascending infections. Symptoms of UTIs: pain during urination, blood in the urine, low-grade fever, abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, loss of appetite, all of those things. How you diagnose it is, of course, you can basically do a urine culture and see if the urine culture grows any bacteria or fungi there, right? So a urinalysis, and then there are antibiotics, good ones that are available for treating the different types of UTIs. Incontinence is when you lose control over urination and you tend to dribble out. What causes it? Overhydration, being nervous, right? Diabetes, using diuretics, post childbirth when there has been some instrumentation in that area. There's so many different reasons for incontinence, and the treatment goes back to what is causing it in the first place, right? Retention is the exact opposite. When you're unable to urinate, this can be because of spinal trauma. If you fell on your back and your spinal cord sustained some trauma, so that would cause urinary retention, because of course the micturition reflex is not there. And what brings to mind here for me is some other reasons are, of course, if you have an enlarged prostate in males, if you have a BPH or something, or if you have general anesthesia in that region, retention. So there was this case of a construction worker in Chicago when I was doing my medical residency there. Uh, Construction worker from Chicago case. So this was a young gentleman who was working on a high rise, and he was, I believe, on the 10th story. He was doing some construction work. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, his harness that he was using, it came undone, and he fell uh, on his back, 10 stories down, okay? So obviously he suffered some fractures of the spine, but he also basically suffered a spinal concussion, major spinal trauma. So he was brought into the medical ICU at the hospital where I worked, and then he was wheeled up to the medical floors. So when I saw this patient, young patient in his late 20s, early 30s, his major complaints were, of course, he had paralysis from the lower back down, right? So what is called paraplegia. Paraplegia. Both of his lower legs were paralyzed, and on top of that, he had chronic constipation and urinary retention, which made sense because of the spinal trauma. He was unable to pass urine properly, right? He had urinary retention, so we had to put in a Foley's catheter in there so that he could pass the urine out. And if you remember, uh, putting in a Foley's catheter was my least favorite medical procedure. All right, it's quite painful. This person, he didn't have any sensations in that area as is because of the spinal trauma. Even so, and for his constipation, which again is a reflex, and he was unable to defecate, we had to give him enemas. Enemas are these washings with saline fluid with salt solution washings in the anal region to wash out the fecal matter. So enemas and enemas and Foley's catheter were what was used to address his urinary retention and his constipation. Okay. Again, if you have a prostate, then you need to reduce the size of the prostate either with medications or with surgery. What characteristics are used to describe urine? Color, pH, specific gravity, smell, all of those things. What conditions cause variation in pH of urine? All kinds of things. The food that you eat, the drugs that you might be taking, the amount of hydration. What are the major components of the urinary tract? Kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, urethra. What tunics are found in each of these? Mucosa, submucosa, adventitia. How do the urethras of a male and female differ? The male urethra is much longer, is divided into three parts. What steps lead to micturition? The urinary bladder fills up. This sensation is sent to the spinal cord, then up to the pons, the micturition reflex. Then the parasympathetic nerves cause the contraction of the detrusor muscle and the relaxation of the internal and external urinary sphincters, making you pass urine. All right, so we have reached the end of chapter 24. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next chapter, which is chapter 25. And this one has to do uh, with the electrolytes and fluid balance in the human body. So let's take a look here. So look at that. About anywhere from 45 to 75% of human body is made up of water, right? As a general rule, the greater the amount of fat, visceral fat that you have, the more dehydrated you are, the less water you're able to carry. The more muscular you are, the more muscle mass, the greater the amount of water you can retain. So you're less likely to be dehydrated under those circumstances. About age, very young children, younger than 6 months of age, and older people older than 65 years of age tend to have uh, less water retention, so they get dehydrated faster than the people in the middle range. Okay, so those are some of the things that we are looking at. So look at that. Skeletal muscle retains about 75% of water. Fat tissue only 20% of water. So since males on an average have more muscle mass, they are able to retain more water as compared to an average female. Okay. All right. So let's take a look at the distribution of your total body water, or TBW. Okay. So your total body water is divided into two components: in extracellular fluid compartment and an intracellular fluid compartment. Okay, so ICF, intracellular fluid, and then ECF for extracellular fluid compartments. Okay, so as the name suggests, intracellular fluid is found inside of the cells, and that is about 2/3 of your total body water. It's found inside of the cells. The extracellular fluid forms about 1/3 of your total body water. Okay, of that extracellular fluid, about 1/3 is in the form of plasma, which forms the liquid part of your blood, and 2/3 of your ECF is found as interstitial fluid, the fluid which is bathing all of your body cells. Okay, so this gives you a general idea of where the different fluids in your body are basically located at. All right, so there you have it. Interstitial fluid versus extracellular fluid. So most of it is here. Um, in the intracellular compartment, and of the extracellular fluid, about 2/3 of that is in the form of the interstitial fluid, the fluid which is found in between your cells. Okay. So here are some examples of other types of extracellular fluid that you have, like your CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid that surrounds your brain and the spinal cord, your synovial fluid in your synovial joints, the aqueous and vitreous humors inside of your eyes. We talked about those structures during our ANP1 discussion, and some fluids of the inner ear, like the endolymph and the perilymph. And so these are some serous fluids within body cavity, right? Like the peritoneal fluid, the pericardial fluid, the pleural fluid, so on and so forth. All right. So your total body water tends to remain fairly constant. All right. Its homeostasis, it tends to maintain its concentration unless you are drastically dehydrated or overhydrated for whatever reason. Okay. But it's extremely important to maintain homeostasis of your total body water as well. So here, this tells you where each of your fluids are located at. So this is what I was talking about earlier. You can take a look at that. All right. And here are relative percentages of different solutes like sodium and potassium and calcium in your um, in your body fluids. Okay. All right, so how does fluid move from one compartment in your body to the next? So for example, when you are dehydrated, this is what happens. Dehydration means there's not much water left in your cells. So your cells are hypertonic. Hypertonic means less water, more salt. So then you feel thirsty because your hypothalamus detects it, and you drink water. When you drink water, this water moves from your bloodstream out into the interstitial fluid, and from the interstitial fluid into your cells, and then your cells become quenched. They get in the water that they need. What happens if you're dehydrated? Now here, the exact opposite. Now there's more water inside of your cells than the water in your bloodstream. So the water moves in the opposite direction. It leaves your cells and goes into your bloodstream. So your cells shrink again, something called crenation, right? Cell shrinkage. So when you're dehydrated. So something to remember at this point, you know how they always advertise drink Gatorade. Now the perfect thirst quencher or some other uh, hydrating fluid. That is out and out a lie and a marketing technique. Gatorade is going to dehydrate you rather than hydrate you. Gatorade is dehydrating, okay? Why? If you look at the ingredients on the bottle, There's a fair amount of sugar in there. First off, there's glucose. Then there's a number of electrolytes there, right? So what does that sugar primarily and the electrolytes do? They actually suck the water into your kidneys and out into the urine. So if anything, Gatorade is going to dehydrate you rather than hydrate you because of the sugar content and the electrolytes in there, okay? And it's very clever marketing technique because the sugar gives you an energy boost, all right, makes you feel good. And then since you feel thirstier after drinking Gatorade, you'll drink even more of it, thinking that you need more. All you need when you're dehydrated is pure water, 100% pure water, okay? Gatorade is not recommended for dehydration or energy drinks for sure. Again, sugar and caffeine and all of that stuff, which will dehydrate you. So pure water is what you need. So does Gatorade have any application then? Yes, it does. In cases like if you are vomiting or if you have diarrhea. So it's dehydrate unless unless you have vomiting and diarrhea, okay? And or diarrhea. Because when you have vomiting and or diarrhea, now you're also losing food and electrolytes, sodium, potassium, calcium, all of that good stuff on top of water. So now Gatorade would be helpful because it'll provide the needed calories in the form of sugar and the electrolytes, okay? Now, if you're throwing up, if you're vomiting, I don't know how much Gatorade you can keep down, but technically, in those cases, sometimes you would need an IV if you have constant vomiting and diarrhea because of food poisoning or cholera or some of that, typhoid, one of those conditions, then you would need IV fluids because you cannot keep anything down. So something to remember. If you have an increase in muscle mass as a result of weight training, will your percentage of body fluid increase? Yes, it will. Which ions are more prevalent in the intracellular fluid? Potassium. Which is most prevalent in the extracellular fluid? Sodium. What is the major distinction in the chemical composition of blood plasma and interstitial fluid? Okay, so blood plasma and interstitial fluid. Blood plasma has about 1/3 of the extracellular fluid. Interstitial fluid is about 2/3. And there's more protein. There's more protein in your blood plasma as compared to the interstitial fluid. Okay. All right. What else? Let me just back up here quickly. Okay. All right. When you are dehydrated, is the net movement of fluid from the blood plasma into the cells? Yes. That is exactly where it is. It's a fluid balance, which obviously means that the amount of fluid that you're taking in should equal the amount that is moving out. So there should be a balance, okay? As a nurse in the nephrology unit or medical ICU or wherever, one of your major jobs will be to maintain an input-output chart on your patients, right? So input-output charts, which basically means input, output, input-output charts. Which basically means that since these patients are unable to eat or drink in many cases on their own, or their kidneys are damaged to the point where they can't regulate their fluid and water and food nutrient levels, you have to keep track of how much fluid is being pumped into them and how much fluid is coming out. So therefore, you will keep a close track of all the fluid that has gone in the form of water or milk or juices or IV infusions, and how much fluid is coming out in the form of urine. And most of these patients are catheterized. So there's a urine bag attached to the Foley's catheter. So you keep a track of how much is going in and how much is coming out. Okay. One of your uh, major jobs here, input output charts for nephrology nurses. Okay. Right. So let's take a look at uh, what this balance looks like. Okay. Fluid intake is on the left-hand side in this picture, which is about 2,500 milliliters, 2.5 liters. Fluid output is about the same, 2.5 liters in a healthy individual. So how do you get your food or your fluid in? Through your drink and food. That's a major source, right? 1,600 milliliters by means of drinking and 700 milliliters in food. So even the so-called dry foods that you don't think of as necessarily containing water, they still have significant amounts of water in them. Okay. All right. So, and then how much water is it that you're losing? About 300 milliliters in the air that you breathe out, sweat about 100 milliliters, and perspiration through your skin about 400 milliliters. These three are insensible losses because you don't feel them, and they're obligatory. They happen all the time, and you don't sense them. Feces and urine, 200 milliliters in the fecal matter, 500 milliliters in the urine. Okay, so uh, that is your sensible water loss. You can feel it, fecal and urinary loss. Okay, you can keep track of how much. That's sensible. This was insensible, right? Sometimes you're breathing fast, so you lose a lot of water, such as when you have a panic attack. So your expired air will have more water. Sometimes you sweat a whole lot more because it's hotter, so you have more loss here. So these are insensible losses. Fecal and urinary output you can still measure, as you can here as well. Okay. So here we are looking at different types of fluid imbalances that you see in the human body. The first one is called volume depletion, which means that you lose more water than you gain, okay? Volume depletion. So isotonic fluid loss is greater than the isotonic fluid gain. What are some of the conditions where you lose excessive amounts of fluid volume? Vomiting, diarrhea, severe burns. Remember, in burns, your skin is waterproof. So when, for example, if you have a third-degree burn, much of your skin is removed. You're losing it to the environment, right? Um, or aldosterone hyposecretion, less aldosterone. So then volume excess, when you have extra isotonic fluid in, okay? And this happens basically because your kidneys are not excreting fluid properly. So this is more common in people with renal failure, either acute or chronic. All right. Then dehydration. Dehydration simply means loss of pure water, not electrolytes, not salts, but water. And that is why when you're dehydrated, you don't need Gatorade. It's pure water that you're lacking. So drink pure water. So it results from, like, if you sweat out a lot, again, dehydration. If you have diabetes, either insipidus or diabetes mellitus, alcohol intake, because that cuts out the ADH secretion, right? Overexposure to cold weather, interestingly. And we had some seriously cold weather a few weeks back, right? Not many people think that cold weather can cause dehydration, but it can cause even more dehydration than hot weather. Keep that in mind, okay? Because your body is working twice as hard to keep you warm. When your body's metabolism increases, rises to keep you warm, it uses up a lot of water. So you need much more water in cold weather as well. Keep that in mind. Uh, on top of that, you also urinate more when it's cold. So you're losing more water either way. All right. Hypotonic hydration, which means replacing fluids with pure water. Okay. And you have to be careful here because if you give too much water to a person, that can cause a condition called water intoxication, where water actually gets inside of your brain cells swell up, you might develop seizures, go into a coma, and die in extreme conditions. And this is kind of common in like those hazing rituals that some uh, universities and colleges have, where people are made to force drink either water or alcohol. It's pushed into their system by force, right? So many hazing rituals have actually, unfortunately, resulted in death because of water intoxication, right? So we'll write it down here. Hazing rituals and water intoxication. All right. Fluid sequestration, which means body fluids are concentrated in one single area, such as what happens with edema. And there are multiple causes of edema. It could be ascites because of liver failure, all the fluid spilling out in your abdomen. It could be pregnancy-related facial edema, such as in preeclampsia. It could be ankle edema in the feet, pedal edema because of congestive heart failure, whatever the reason. Pericardial effusion, fluid around the heart because of infections or trauma. Pleural effusion, fluid around the lungs, similar. So here you're looking at edema, right? Marked edema of the left leg, as you can see. This one looks like lymphedema. So that's lymph that is accumulating in this person's left leg, as you can see. And here are some reasons why you might have increased formation of interstitial fluid, okay? So how does your body regulate its fluid levels, right? So then you have a thirst center, which is found again in your hypothalamus, okay? And your thirst center gets activated because of these reasons. If you have a fall in your blood volume and your blood pressure. If those two values fall, you start to feel thirsty. Your body gets the message that it's low on fluids, it needs to drink more. Increased blood osmolarity, which means too much salt. Again, when do you feel like you have too much salt? When you're low on water. That makes you thirsty. Or your salivary secretions. If you're not producing enough saliva, that will also cause your thirst center to activate. So what are the things that deactivate your thirst center, make you stop drinking water? If your blood volume or blood pressure increases, if the amount of salt in your blood decreases, if your salivary secretions increase, or if your stomach becomes distended, filled up with stuff, that's when your thirst center gets deactivated. And that's why if you're very thirsty, even just wetting your mouth, right? Like just rinsing your mouth with water, it will make you feel your thirst go away because that increases your salivary secretions. So your brainstem gets the message there's enough water in the system, okay? So what are the two major sources of fluid intake? Food and water, right? What are two ways that fluid output is categorized? Sensible water loss and insensible water loss. And which one is based on the hydrated state of the body, the insensible water loss? How would you distinguish? There's also the obligatory and the non-obligatory loss. So the non-obligatory loss, like urine and fecal loss, that is based on how much hydration is there in the body. How would you distinguish fluid deficiency from dehydration? In fluid deficiency, there's a lack of both water and salt. In dehydration, there's only a lack of pure water. The salt levels are higher, actually. Okay, so total body fluid goes down if you have fluid deficiency. Blood osmolarity um, stays same in fluid deficiency, but goes up in dehydration because more salt, less water in dehydration. Okay. What stimuli activate the thirst center? If you have decreased salivary secretions, if you have too much blood volume or blood pressure, uh, uh, if you have too low blood pressure, blood volume, and what was the third factor here for thirst center? So we talked about the decreased salivary secretions, low blood pressure, and low blood volume, right? What am I missing here? Oh, and increased blood osmolarity. If you have too much salt, that will also activate your thirst drive, as we see here. Okay, which of these four hormones, angiotensin 2, ADH, aldosterone, and ANP, increases urine output? The only one that does is ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. The other three, angiotensin 2, ADH, aldosterone, they all retain water. So they decrease urine output, in other words, okay? So here's a difference between what are called electrolytes and non-electrolytes. Electrolytes are those ions, charged particles that can carry electricity, like sodium, potassium, calcium, all of those. Non-electrolytes are those substances that cannot carry electricity, like organic molecules like sugar, glucose itself. Okay, so let's start with the first, one of the most important ions in the human body, sodium. Look at that, 99% of your extracellular fluid is sodium, 1% of the intracellular fluid as well. And what maintains these concentrations is your sodium potassium pumps, okay? Uh, the normal levels of sodium should be in between 135 to 145 milliequivalents per liter, which means that you should be consuming about 2 grams of sodium or salt per day. The average American consumes anywhere from 20 to 50 times that, okay? Way more salt than we need. And what does that extra salt do? It retains too much water in our system, makes us heavier and hypertensive, high blood pressure, okay? So watch the salt content in your diet. Again, that is the reason why people with congestive heart failure are put on a DASH diet. What is the DASH diet? DASH for dietary approach, right, to stopping hypertension. That's what the DASH diet is, which is prescribed for patients uh, with congestive heart failure, right? Patients with congestive heart failure or even renal failure, they are put on a DASH diet. It's pretty much like the Mediterranean diet, okay? No processed foods, no red meat, vegetables and fruits, low amounts of salt and sodium, water, olive oil. It's, like I said, very akin to the Mediterranean diet, which is recommended here. So why is sodium so important? It maintains the osmolarity of your cells, right? It holds fluid inside of the cells. So if you're hyper natremic, which means there's too much salt, then your body cells are going to retain um, then your body cells are going to get dehydrated. High levels of salt in your bloodstream, in your interstitial fluid, it'll suck all of the fluid out of your cells. You're in a hypertonic state, right? If you have too little salt or too little sodium, something called hyponatremia, then there is going to be too much water inside of your cells. Okay, so let me put it this way: hyponatremia, which means lack of sodium or lack of salt. Hyponatremia gives you uh, your cells swelling, okay, which is called hemolysis. Hemolysis. Your cells will blow up with water and burst. If you have hypernatremia in your bloodstream, too much salt, too much sodium, hypernatremia, it will cause crenation or shrinkage. Crenation or shrinkage of your body cells. And so that's why to prevent either of those conditions, you need uh, the normal amounts of salt or of sodium. All right. So here are three different hormones and what do they do to your sodium levels. Aldosterone increases sodium. ADH uh, decreases the sodium concentration. ANP decreases or reduces sodium by making you urinate it out, as you can see here. Okay. All right. So the second electrolyte that we're going to talk about here is potassium. The potassium ion, which is your chief ion in the intracellular fluid, as you can see, 98% of potassium ion is found there, only 2% in ECF. So these concentrations are again maintained by the sodium potassium pump, okay? And why is potassium ions needed? They have a profound effect on your heart rhythm. In fact, your potassium ion levels need to be very closely regulated and monitored in between 3.5 to 5.0 milliequivalents per liter. Any disbalance there, and you can end up with cardiac arrhythmias, arrhythm of the heart, and die because of cardiac or respiratory arrest, as you see here. In fact, one of the chief lethal injections used wherever lethal injections are legal is actually potassium chloride. Potassium chloride is used as lethal injections, okay? And so that should tell you how important it is to regulate your potassium ion levels, okay? At this point, I'm also reminded of of kind of like a intriguing case that came to the fore a few years back. So there was this massive earthquake in one of these South American countries. I forget if it was Peru or Bolivia. So one of those countries, let me make notes here. South American earthquake victim. All right, so in any case, this was uh, quite a severe case of tremors, right? Major earthquake, a lot of people, thousands of people lost their lives, and so these rescue teams were out searching for any possible survivors. So they came across this gentleman who they found alive after about 48 hours, and he was buried under a significant amounts of rubble. And what they saw was that, and he was crying out in pain, right? He was still conscious. And what they saw was that there was this big beam or a pillar of a building that had fell and trapped his right leg. And so he could not get out from under that pillar, right? And so he was asking for help. Uh, so these rescue teams, which was made up of not paramedics, but people from the neighborhood, their own, teams that they make for digging people and animals out. So they got to the scene, and being the good Samaritans that they were, they all got together, and then they lifted that heavy beam from the person's leg, and they pulled him uh, out from under there. Uh, but what they noticed was, within minutes after the person was pulled out, he just his eyes rolled back into the sockets. He just became all limp. He stopped responding, and so they got alarmed. And so then at that point, they called the paramedics to the scene. The paramedics got there, transported the person to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead on arrival. Right. So strange case. Um, Nobody could figure out what had happened. So the body was sent for autopsy. At the time of autopsy, it came to the uh, notice of the forensic pathologists that this person had actually died because of cardiac arrest. His heart had stopped because of arrhythmia. So what had actually happened? Then they took the whole history of the patient, and then they put the medical pieces of the puzzle together. What had happened was, as the beam fell and trapped this person's leg under, so obviously this cut out all of the blood supply to his lower leg, right? So when the blood supply stopped to his lower legs, after the first 6 to 7 hours, his muscles started to necrose, to die out in the leg. Muscles hold a lot of potassium in them, right? So muscles are a potential uh, reservoir of potassium ions. So what happened when all of these blood vessels and muscles started to necrose in his lower leg? This potassium started to spill out, and it accumulated in his lower leg. But uh, ironically, the same beam that was responsible for this person's misery, trapping him uh, under itself, right, and cutting out the blood supply to his lower leg, was also a blessing in disguise. This beam was also keeping him alive, because of this beam, the blood, which was loaded with this potassium in the lower leg, was unable to get back to the heart. It was sequestered. It was isolated in the lower leg, right? As soon as the beam was lifted and the blood started to recirculate back, these massive lethal doses of potassium accumulated in his lower leg started circulating back to his heart, and that caused instant cardiac arrhythmia, cardiac arrest, and he died. All right. So how could this situation have been prevented? If it were an experienced paramedic who knew what they were dealing with, they would have probably given him a potassium chelating agent, something that binds with potassium and keeps the level low, and then gradual uh, lifting of the beam, right? Slow reestablishment of the circulation while giving him a potassium uh, chelating agent to bind the extra potassium, right? Uh, and then have a crash cart nearby, of course, when if the person goes in cardiac arrhythmia, you have to set the rhythm back again. All right, so one case that I was just reminded of looking at something like hyperkalemia, which means high levels of uh, total body potassium, right? You get potassium from fruits and vegetables. Bananas are a good source of potassium. Many people know that. Uh, and you lose greater amounts of potassium with if you're on diuretics, like in congestive heart failure, if you have too much aldosterone secretion, uh, and high blood pH also, okay? All right, so next up we are looking at changes in your blood plasma hydrogen concentration, or the acidity, right? Remember, the hydrogen ions have to do with how acidic your blood is. So if you have too much acid in your extracellular fluid, right, this excess hydrogen ions or acid tends to move into your cells. But for the hydrogen to move into your cells, the potassium has to move out, okay? So uh, too much hydrogen moving into the cells, potassium moving out. Uh, Too much potassium moving into the cells, the hydrogen ions have to move out. So they move in opposite directions, okay? All right, something to remember. So in other words, one thing that you can do to prevent hyperkalemia, which would have helped this person, this earthquake victim, by the way, that we were talking about, is to give them uh, insulin, to give him insulin, because what insulin will do is insulin will cause um, it will cause the acidity to decrease, right? So insulin will cause hydrogen ions to move inside of the cells, right? And that would potentially prevent uh, hyperkalemia, from potassium to accumulate into the cells in high levels. All right. So giving insulin basically is a protective measure against hyperkalemia, is what you have to remember here. All right. So then next we have the chloride ions. This is a negatively charged anion. Uh, Chloride again is an important part of salt. Salt is sodium chloride. Much of this chloride comes from the salt that we eat again. And we lose salt by means of sweat secretion and stomach secretions as well, urine. Okay. High levels of blood chloride levels is called hyperchloremia. Low levels are called hypochloremia, as you can see here. Okay. What else can cause hypochloremia? Protracted vomiting. If you're vomiting a lot, you're losing much of stomach acid, and stomach acid is made up of hydrogen chloride. So there you have it, hydrochloric acid, low levels of chlorine as well. Calcium, again, you need calcium for healthy bones and teeth, for muscle contraction, for blood clotting, all of those things. You get much of the calcium in your diet, right? Uh, High levels of calcium are called hypercalcemia. Low levels are called hypocalcemia. What can give you high levels or hypercalcemia? If you have a tumor in your parathyroid glands, as an example, right? Hyperparathyroidism equals hypercalcemia. Hypoparathyroidism will give you hypocalcemia. What happens if you have hypocalcemia? Tetany. Your muscles start contracting. What happens with hypercalcemia? That your heart slows down. You go into bradycardia. Okay. Phosphates, we need phosphate to form DNA and RNA. Phosphate is also an important part of many amino acids for healthy bones and teeth. Now remember, phosphate moves in the opposite direction as calcium. So if calcium is being reabsorbed, phosphate will be excreted and vice versa. Something else to remember here. Magnesium, another important electrolyte, right? It's used for many metabolic reactions. You get magnesium from leafy green vegetables. Uh, so why do electrolytes exert a greater osmotic pressure than the non-electrolytes? Because they can carry electrical charges, okay? They can carry electrical charges with them, and so they tend to uh, stick in one place, either inside of the cell or outside of the cell, and therefore greater osmotic pressure is exerted by them. What is the net direction of potassium in response to a decrease in pH? What happens as a result of decrease in pH, which means you have high levels of hydrogen? High levels of hydrogen means this hydrogen will be pushed into the cells, and so the potassium will move out of the cells. The net direction of potassium movement is from the cells out into the plasma. So here you're looking at a hormone called angiotensin 2, which is secreted. Uh, Actually, this is uh, a three-step process, right? How you form angiotensin 2. You first make a protein called angiotensinogen in your liver. Then a hormone called renin, which is secreted by your kidneys, causes the conversion of angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. And then another enzyme by the name of ACE, for angiotensin converting enzyme, turns angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Once you do form angiotensin 2, it is a potent vasoconstrictor. It causes your blood pressure to spike, to rise. So how it does is, this is by causing vasoconstriction in the blood vessels. It also decreases urinary output in your kidneys. It activates the thirst center, and it causes increased secretion of both aldosterone and ADH. So taken together, your blood pressure goes up. And so here in this picture, you can look at the entire sequence of events that I just mentioned in the picture, okay? ADH, antidiuretic hormone, comes from the posterior pituitary, causes water to be reabsorbed into your bloodstream from the principal cells in the collecting tubule and the collecting duct of the kidneys, as you can see here, okay? So what that does is it increases your blood pressure again, okay? So ADH stimulates the thirst center in the hypothalamus, increases water reabsorption in the kidneys, and causes vasoconstriction of blood vessels. Taken together, your blood pressure goes up. We talked about diabetes insipidus before, right? Lack of ADH. There's two types: central diabetes insipidus and nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. Aldosterone, secreted by the zona glomerulosa of your adrenal glands. And what it does is it causes salt and water both to be retained, to be reabsorbed from the kidneys and retained in your body, thereby increasing your blood pressure. ANP, now this is an opposite hormone. It's secreted by the right atrium, and it causes increased excretion of sodium or salt in the urine. Okay. So how does angiotensin 2 alter fluid output and potentially alter fluid intake? Angiotensin 2 causes vasoconstriction. It causes your thirst mechanism to kick in. It causes you to do what else? It causes increased secretion of aldosterone and ADH. Taken together, it will increase fluid retention in your system. How does the homeostatic system involving ADH function? ADH secreted in response to low levels of body water, and ADH causes water retention as well. How does aldosterone influence the contents and volume of fluid output? Aldosterone uh, reabsorbs sodium or salt from the urine. Okay, so it increases salt concentrations in your blood plasma. How does ANP influence fluid output? ANP increases the loss of sodium or salt from the body, okay? And it reduces the blood pressure. Angiotensin 2 and ADH increase blood pressure. ANP reduces or decreases blood pressure. All right, so the normal body pH is in between 7.35 to 7.45, slightly alkaline, as we see here. And so what maintains our body pH at that level is buffers. Of course, buffers are those substances that prevent too much fluctuation in the acidity or the alkalinity of the human body. There's three of those buffers, right? We talked about bicarbonate, number one, proteins, number two, and phosphate. So these are the three body buffers that maintain the body's pH. So what are some of the acids that are produced in the human body naturally? So you have what are called fixed acids. They are basically acids that are produced at all times regardless, such as lactic acid. And this happens because of glycolysis, anaerobic respiration taking place in our cells at any time. Phosphoric acid, and this uh, is formed by the breakdown of your RNA and DNA, your nucleic acid metabolism, and also ketones or keto acids from from fat metabolism, right? When the fat is metabolized and broken down, then you form ketones. Also in diabetics, remember, in the absence of insulin, um, since sugar is not used as a food source, then the fat is being used as a food source, and fat breakdown leads to ketoacidosis in these patients. So what are some volatile acids? Well, these depend on how fast uh, or low are you breathing. So bicarbonate, carbonic acid, right? Carbonic acid is called a volatile acid because you can basically breathe it out. If too much carbon dioxide accumulates, you simply hyperventilate and you get rid of it. So what are some of the conditions that cause your blood acidity or hydrogen concentrations to increase? So if you're diabetic, not taking your insulin, ketoacidosis, right? If you are on a keto diet, ketoacidosis, interestingly. So not such a good idea to be on a keto diet for long periods of time, right? If you're an animal protein consumer, a meat eater, more acidic, as you can see again. Diarrhea. If you have ongoing diarrhea, protracted diarrhea, you're losing a lot of bicarbonate ions in your, uh, along with your motions, and that would cause your hydrogen ions to go up as well, okay? So what does the kidney do? Kidney makes your urine extremely acidic to get rid of the extra acid in your system. All right, so here is a picture that is talking about those factors. So then what are some other conditions that can cause you to go into a metabolic alkalosis, low levels of hydrogen, okay? So those could be things like protracted vomiting. If you are vomiting constantly, like in pregnancy, some women have pregnancy-induced vomiting, right? Or cancer patients or patients on chemotherapy with protracted vomiting, you can go into respiratory alkalosis because you're losing a lot of hydrogen ions by means of your stomach acid, okay? So what do the kidneys do there? They make your urine extremely uh, alkaline to get rid of the extra alkalinity in your blood, okay? And here's a picture. All right, so here are the three buffers that we were mentioning before: protein, phosphate, and bicarbonate. The three buffers that ensure that your body's pH does not change too much. It keeps the acid and base levels within those narrow limits here, right? Okay, so we are looking at the three types. What is meant by acid-base balance? That your pH is in between 7.35 to 7.45. How are fixed acids distinguished from volatile acids? Fixed acids have to be regulated by means of your kidneys, long-term regulation. Volatile acids you can breathe out, like carbonic acid, by means of respiration. How do the kidneys regulate fixed acids to help maintain blood pH in response to increased blood hydrogen concentration? They cause more hydrogen ions to be lost in your urine, making your urine more acidic, thereby maintaining your blood pH levels. Explain why respiration does not normally influence acid-base balance, because respiration is only for volatile acids like carbonic acid. It doesn't have anything to do with the fixed ones like phosphoric, lactic, and keto acids. What are the three chemical buffering systems? Bicarbonate, protein, and phosphate. What is the general amount of time required to maintain pH by the chemical buffering system? Long-term. And respiratory system, short-term control. Kidneys, long-term control again. All right, so acid-base disturbances could be either acidosis or alkalosis. Acidosis is when your pH, blood pH is below 7.35. Alkalosis is when your blood pH is above 7.45. All right. If your body is able to regulate and deal with this, it's called compensated uh, acid-base disturbance. If your body is going into failure, unable to regulate the pH, it's called uncompensated. What types of people are more likely to develop uncompensated acid-base disturbance? People with kidney problems, with kidney failure, chronic or acute renal failure, of course. So there are four categories of acid-base disturbances that we will look at: respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, metabolic acidosis, and metabolic alkalosis. So let's start with respiratory acidosis. What does that mean? Any condition that will cause your breathing rate to go down, where you are not blowing out as much carbon dioxide as you should, respiratory acidosis. What are the two prime candidates? People with COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which includes chronic bronchitis and emphysema, and people with sleep apnea, right? And we talked about those conditions before. So they are not breathing carbon dioxide out as much as they should. So this tends to build up in their uh, system, right? And so that is what is leading to respiratory acidosis. So then what is respiratory alkalosis? The exact opposite, where you're breathing out extra amounts of carbon dioxide, like when you hyperventilate. And this could be like because of anxiety, phobia, panic attack, or you can even do it deliberately, whatever, right? So, or if you're at like some high level above sea level, like on top of a mountain or someplace due to hypoxia, you can have it too. So severe anemia, high altitude, congestive heart failure, some conditions that will give you respiratory alkalosis, or if you overdose on aspirin, because that causes acidosis, metabolic acidosis, and that will trigger you to go into respiratory alkalosis to get rid of the metabolic acidosis that you have, okay? So what are some reasons for metabolic acidosis? Uh, DKA, number one, diabetic ketoacidosis, uncontrolled diabetes, as you can see. Or if you have excessive alcohol intake and that breaks down into acetic acid, that can also send you down spiraling into metabolic acidosis, okay? So how does your, uh, how do your kidneys respond to this? By making your urine extremely acidic, trying to get rid of the metabolic acidosis, okay? Metabolic alkalosis, some of the possible causes, the exact opposite, uh, protracted vomiting. You're throwing out extra amounts of stomach acid, you go into metabolic alkalosis. Or if you are overusing or overdosed on diuretics, that can cause increased loss of acids by the kidneys as well. Okay, a more rare cause, large amounts of antacids. Not many people consume that many Rolaids anyway, so that's metabolic alkalosis. Lactic acidosis, when you're pushing your body beyond the limit, right? So you're um, switching from aerobic to anaerobic respiration and producing extra amounts of lactic acid, that can happen. Ketoacidosis, diabetes, number one cause uh, of that, right? Uncontrolled diabetes. So how do the kidneys respond to this situation? If you have high levels of acid, your kidneys excrete extra hydrogen ions and reabsorb bicarbonate ions, returning your pH to normal. Okay. If you have decreased blood hydrogen concentration, in other words, if you're in metabolic alkalosis, the exact opposite happens. Now your kidneys will reabsorb hydrogen ions back and excrete the bicarbonate ions, okay? All right, so let's see. Respiratory acidosis with renal compensation. What that means is if you have conditions like COPD again or sleep apnea, whatever, you have respiratory acidosis, how would your kidneys make up for that, compensate for that? Your kidneys will increase the secretion of hydrogen in the urine and reabsorb bicarbonate ion, right? What happens when you have respiratory alkalosis like hyperventilation? How would your kidneys react to that? The exact opposite. Your kidneys will increase the secretion of bicarb in your urine, thereby making your urine alkaline and reabsorb hydrogen ions. Okay. So how does metabolic acidosis with respiratory compensation work? If you have metabolic acidosis, you will hyperventilate, trying to get rid of extra acid by means of carbon dioxide. So hyperventilation, okay, increased respiratory rate. If you have metabolic alkalosis, how would your respiratory system compensate? By underventilation. You'll breathe slowly, such as what happens with what? When do you have shallow breathing? Uh, if you have gone into metabolic alkalosis as a result of excessive vomiting, then your respiratory rate slows down to hold back as much carbon dioxide and increasing the acidity of your blood. All right, so how does a compensated acid-base disturbance differ from an uncompensated? Well, in compensated acid-base disturbance, your pH still remains normal. Your body is able to deal with it. Uncompensated, you're going into unchecked acidosis or alkalosis. Describe the change for each of the following variables if an individual hyperventilates. What happens to your blood CO2? It goes down. You're breathing out extra carbon dioxide. What happens to your blood hydrogen ion concentration? Goes down again. What happens to your blood pH? Increases. You become less acidic and more alkaline. So blood pH goes up. Okay. What is the primary cause of metabolic alkalosis? Vomiting, excessive vomiting, right? How does renal compensation affect blood plasma levels of bicarbonate ions? Uh, Renal compensation affect blood plasma levels of bicarbonate ions. So it will increase, well, it depends on what type of compensation are you looking at. If it's for respiratory acidosis, then your levels of bicarbonate ions will go up. If you're dealing with respiratory alkalosis, then your bicarbonate ion levels will go down. How does respiratory compensation affect blood uh, partial pressure of carbon dioxide? Um, Again, if you're respiring faster, hyperventilating, your carbon dioxide levels will go low. If you're underventilating, breathing slower, then your carbon dioxide levels will go up. Okay, so identify the primary disturbance and the degree of compensation. Okay, let's see. pH is 7.20. So what is it? Straight up. It's less than 7.35. This is metabolic acidosis. This is acidosis at least, right? So what's happening to your carbon dioxide levels? Carbon dioxide levels uh, here are 35. What is the normal level? 35 to 45. So carbon dioxide is normal. Bicarbonate normal should be in between 22 and 26. This is 17. So you have low bicarb, which means metabolic acidosis. So here you're dealing with uncompensated metabolic acidosis, okay? Uncompensated uh, metabolic acidosis. Okay, here again, acidosis 7.20, which is less than 7.35. This is acidosis. How about your carbon dioxide levels here? 25, which is less than here, right? And your bicarbonate is 17, which is less too. This is uncompensated uh, metabolic acidosis again, okay? This is uh, somewhat compensated. pH is still low, but your lungs are trying to compensate for it. Here it is uncompensated altogether, right? All right. Then here the pH is 7.36. This is normal. Your carbon dioxide levels are low, while your bicarbonate levels are about normal, right? So what is this? This is compensated, first of all, and because your carbon dioxide levels are low, this is compensated respiratory um, compensated respiratory alkalosis. Okay. All right. So here we are done with chapters 24 and 25. So please remember again, you have your lab practical today. You have your study guide sent out for your lecture exam number 3 next week. You still have your case studies to work on and your lecture quizzes on McGraw-Hill Connect website to work on. And I will be updating your grades as far as your lab practical is concerned tomorrow. So feel free to check then. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please let me know. Enjoy the rest of your weekend and the next week. And I'll see you all virtually next week. Remember, we do have a lecture on chapter 28, which is the reproductive system, after we take our lecture exam. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.